Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is a little piece of heaven in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 25, Oblivion, Taking the Stage. Not even 3 seconds had passed since his enemy absorbed Reishi from the ejected souls within the valley, yet Amagai was already trying to find a short breather that would allow him to release his Bankai. Just those 3 seconds had been enough to prove that the difference in power became as uneven as it could ever get. And it had taken his opponent only 3 seconds to pummel Amagai into a mess. Despite all his training and all his experience as a member of the 2nd Division and the Onmitsukido, he had been unable to dodge most of the strikes and hits. A kick to the abdomen, a punch in his injured shoulder, and his failed attempt at parrying a sword had cost Amagai a lot of strength. Getsuga Tensho. 2 energy beams came from both sides and forcefully stopped the enemy leader from pursuing yet another hit on him. Even if he was shrouded in energy, Ganryu still didn't take the risk of tanking the 2 Getsuga head-on. He backed off and finally gifted Amagai with a short break. Looks like it's not going too well. At last, Amagai was able to take a deep breath, and so he retorted only after a moment. Once he's started absorbing the ambient Reishi, I'm having troubles reading some of his movements. He breathed out. Aware of the danger, he didn't glance in Ishaine's or Ichigo's direction and kept his eyes on the enemy. It's weird he can even do that. First bounce, now these guys. Though only Quincy could do it. Absorb the Reishi. Ichigo, standing on Amagai's left side, warily noted. Let's think about that later. Amagai-san. Ishaine said after glancing on the man's injuries. Amagai shook his head. It's not fatal, but it sure as hell makes moving the arm troubling. I guess I really have to go Bankai on this guy. He stated and straightened his back, only to see Ishaine's hand in front of him. Don't. I noticed it once I released my Zanpakuto, but here, in the Valley of Screams, you really do get tired a lot faster than you do normally. Bankai would flat out burn you out. From a distance, Ganryu released a haughty laughter. So you defeated my men? Still pointless. Even the 3 of you won't be able to prevent the destruction of the Soul Society. Look. We are approaching the final destination. The Valley of Screams shook once more, causing a crease of worry to form on all of their foreheads. If we had more time, I'd say let him absorb even more. There must be a limit of how much Reishi he can absorb, right? Ichigo eyed his father questioningly. But it was Amagai who responded. We would most likely be dead by then. This guy said that they have been living here for the past 1,000 years. He had plenty of time to raise the limit of how much he can take. Incoming. At the sound of Ishaine's yell, they all jumped away, effectively avoiding most of daggers that suddenly rained upon them. The ones they did not dodge were blocked by swift movements of their swords. However, since Amagai was fairly handicapped, Ishaine did that not just for himself but, by quickly flashing to him, for the captain of the 3rd Division as well. Thanks. Amagai breathed out. Ishaine was already forming a response, but, sensing a movement, he was unable to say it out loud. With his Zanpakuto enveloped in energy, he managed to parry a fast swipe but was surprised to find himself get pushed back. He narrowed his eyes and got a stronger grip on his sword. Using all of his might, he managed to stop the enemy leader from driving him further back. Bakudo number 4. Hanawa. A yellow rope made from Reishi slithered around his opponent's arms and body from behind, slowly immobilizing him. However, Ishaine remained cautious. As Kido was a form of energy, he wasn't sure the man wouldn't be able to absorb it in the same way he could do with the ambient Reishi around them. Reikakyo. In the last moment, Ishaine jumped backwards and watched as a fireball as large as he was swallowed the enemy leader and caused a small explosion to echo across the battlefield. He wasn't convinced an attack of that magnitude was enough to end the fight, but, because of the mixed energies, he was unable to get a lock on his opponent's Ryutsu. They all waited. The Valley of Screams shook once more and the rumble completely masked a quiet noise that came out of their enemy's position. It was only in the last moment that Ishaine registered a barrage of daggers rushing towards him. Watch out! It was impossible to flash away from the daggers. Dozens in amount, They had been thrown skillfully and covered every possible direction, leaving Ishine and the other two to either dodge them reflexively or to try and block them with their Zanpakuto. Ishine tightened his jaw and gripped his sword with both his hands. He took a deep breath and, just as the daggers closed up on him, exhaled. Along with it, he brought his Zanpakuto down with such force, the air pressure alone blew the daggers away from him. After he did that, he focused on the enemy leader that slowly walked out of the smoke. The man was bearing the marks of the explosion, yet his movements were still clean. It was difficult to tell whether the attack had injured him or not because he was already absorbing yet even more Reishi. Bakudo number 4. Hanawa. Ichigo's voice coming from behind the man accompanied the Kido spell that once again winded around the enemy leader and prevented him from moving. This again? You never learn, do you? Ichigo's head popped up from behind him and Ishine saw his son nodding towards him. Hit him with the best you have. You too, Amagai-san. Annoyed at being ignored, Ganryu released a scoff. Why do you even keep trying? You must realize by now that why dash. Trust me. Ichigo unceremoniously interrupted him with a loud exclamation and Ishine felt his intense stare. He had no idea what the teen was planning but it didn't matter. He trusted his son. Not even a second later, Ishine appeared in front of Ganryu and brought down his glowing Zanpakuto once more. Getsuga Tensho. Reikakua. From his side, Amagai also exclaimed. The two attacks joined at the point of impact and created an explosion that blew both Ishine and Amagai backwards. Trying to correct his trajectory, Ishine mentally prayed for his son. Once he cast the Kido spell and called out to his other two comrades, Ichigo focused on his spiritual energy. Deep inside of his mind, he felt one of his spirit's gentle touch. Don't force it, Ichigo. Just go with the flow. When he felt his father's spiritual pressure sharply rising, he leaped into the air, right above the enemy leader, and fought against the pressure of the explosion. The shockwave was strong, but lasted only for a second. After it died down, he quickly returned to his previous position, behind the man, and relaxed his whole body. Even with his eyes closed, he knew Ganryu survived and was now trying to absorb the Reishi to heal himself and to power up even further. Ichigo wasn't about to let him do that. Easy now. You know what to do. You've done it before. Your imagination is your strongest weapon. He took a few short breaths to get his blood pumping and then focused all of his attention to the Reishi around him. Picturing it as best as he could, an image slowly formed within his mind. He saw Ganryu standing in front of him as well as the spiritual particles that were rushing towards the man. With his hands, he reached to them. Letting some of his Ryuryoku to leak out of his body, he focused on each and every spiritual particle and then mentally touched them. He could feel them protesting, as if some invisible force compelled them to move to the Ganryu's aid and it almost broke his concentration. Yet he persisted, his strong will managed to recover in time. The spiritual particles were still moving, albeit a bit slower. He pulled on them as much as he could, causing beads of sweat to form on his forehead and then trickle down his face. Come on, come on. His concentration was beginning to waver. The hold on his spiritual energy as well as on the spiritual particles was lessening until he heard an anxious yell. What the hell did you do to me? What's happening? He grinned. It was working. Ishine and Amagai looked at each other. The explosion had pushed them quite far and, so far, they didn't hear a word from Ichigo. But just as they flashed back to their opponent, they heard the man yelling. Ganryu was visibly injured and was clearly trying to heal himself using the ambient Reishi, yet nothing seemed to be happening. Instead of flowing into him, the spiritual particles seemed to be frozen in midair, floating there like a bizarre act against the nature. Looking past the man, Ishine noticed Ichigo standing right behind him with closed eyes and incredibly concentrated expression, the kind he had never seen on the teen's face before. He was leaking a bit of his Ryuryoku. Ishine blinked in surprise. That Ryuryoku was a lot brighter than before. I don't know what's going on but this is our chance. The sound of Amagai's voice brought Ishine back from his amazement. He shook his head and glanced in the other captain's direction. Yeah. On two. Both of them brought their Ryutsu up and rushed at Ganryu from both sides. See curse you Shinigami. Damn you to he. HAAA. Just as Ganryu finished his scream, two Zanpakuto cut deeply into his body and sliced him into several pieces. His eyes almost bulged out and he instantly lost his consciousness. In a matter of seconds, his body turned into a dust of spiritual particles that a weak puff of wind easily scattered in every direction. His death, sudden as it was, marked the end of the battle. Thud. Ichigo. In a flash, Ishine appeared next to his son and grabbed him by his shoulders. The teen had fallen on his knees and was struggling to breathe. Only then Ishine noticed the translucent mass of Reishi slowly moving towards Ichigo. What's going on? Ichigo managed to glance up. I don't know. I was just trying to prevent him from absorbing more Reishi B but now it's all forcing itself into me. He breathed out. Ishine couldn't help but to be stunned. Knowing who and what his son was, he quickly realized what Ichigo had tried to do. But he couldn't remain still for long as the valley shook once again and the Reishi around them began to swirl even faster. He saw Amagai walking up to them. Since all this Reishi is basically energy of ejected souls, I think it's easy to deduce the reason they are drawn to you now. Now that the ones who manipulated them are gone, they are trying to find their purpose by binding themselves to you, someone who tried to use them. He quickly explained to Ichigo, causing the teen to curse. Damn it. Amagai walked past them but didn't stop. It's not over yet. That construct over there is the cause behind the valley's movement, and since the one who controlled it is dead, I fear it will only cause more destruction. It may even do something about the rejected souls. Another tremor shook the valley. This time, it was powerful enough to knock all of them from their feet. Let's destroy it then. Amagai got up and glanced over his shoulder at Ichigo, sprawled on the ground. I don't think that's possible. That thing is powered by the Reishi of the ejected souls and you cannot destroy Reishi. You can convert it, transform it, but not destroy it. It's the same principle as with any kind of energy. He explained, and his gaze fell on his second sword. His Bakuto. Ishine and Ichigo both looked at the man. Amagai laughed. It's pretty ironic that this thing may in the end be our savior. Going from a tool of revenge to a tool of salvation, fate really must be mocking me. He said and turned his attention back to the construct. Prepare to leave this place. Kurosake, thank you for saving my soul. Soul Society. More than an hour had passed since Ichigo, Ishine, and Amagai had entered the Senkaimon Gate. At first, only Yamamoto had stood in front of it as he had been waiting for them to return and give report on the state of the situation. However, as time passed, other captains had found their way to the place as well. The phenomenon in the sky had caused another fit of panic and chaos within the lower ranks of Godi 13, but it had been squashed soon enough. Therefore, once they had completed their mission concerning the Kazumioji conspiracy, they began to move to the 1st Division barracks. But there, they found rubble and debris, what prompted them to immediately seek the commander. It was only there that they received new information. What if they won't make it in time, Yamaji? Shunsui. With his eyes closed, Yamamoto took a deep breath and squeezed the top of his cane. Then he looked at his two former students, Yukitake and Kiraku. Most of Kiraku's features were hidden behind a shadow from his tipped hat, and so it was hard to tell his expression. However, he was clearly staring at Yamamoto and ignoring Yukitake. Soul Society can be rebuilt, was all Yamamoto said in response, causing the shadow on Kiraku's face to grow even darker. Even Yukitake's expression darkened, which was something almost no one was accustomed to. Fortunately, nobody, aside from Yamamoto, noticed it because of a slight glimmer that seemed to surround the Senkaimon Gate. A moment later, 3 figures literally flopped through it and hit the ground with a loud thud. Captain Anohana. On it, Commander. In a flash, the captain of the 4th Division appeared next to the trio. She kneeled down and made a quick examination. Together with her vice-captain, they separated the 3 men and put them next to each other. The only one who still had his eyes opened was Ishine. It took him a few seconds to realize where he was, and when he did, he released a loud sigh for all of them to hear. We made it. A collective sigh echoed through the clearing. Finished with the short examination, Anohana raised her head and looked at Yamamoto with one of her angelic smiles. They are wounded but nothing serious. It's mostly just severe exhaustion. Yamamoto nodded and glanced at Ishine, who, after making sure Ichigo was next to him, returned his gaze. It's good to have you back, Captain Shiba. Are you fine enough to give a report? Ishine chuckled but also shook his head. I've never been better, Commander. But I think it's Captain Amagai from whom you should hear it. Ichigo. Kurosaki-san, you have a visitor. Ichigo gladly accepted a glass of pleasantly cold water and took a long sip out of it before finally giving a reaction. Okay. He muttered and returned the glass to the medic's hand. He watched her go and rubbed his eyes. While he was a bit annoyed that the captain of the 4th Division forced him to stay in the 4th Division's care for a whole day, he was also kind of grateful. Ever since he had woken up, he had been suffering through a bad headache, and being in the 4th Division medical compound had ensured he had had a fairly calm day. Then the doors to his room burst open and a small figure dashed towards him. Before he could even react, a pair of small, thin arms wrapped around his torso. Ichigo Nii-chan. Almost reflexively, he patted the visitor's head and formed a tiny smile. Hey, I'm glad to see you're back, Rurokiyo. The girl raised her head and showed him her pout. Ichigo raised his arms in defense. Sorry, I meant Ruri. The girl immediately stopped pouting and put a bright smile on her face. Then she frowned and retracted one of her arms from him only to slap his torso. I was worried about you. The smile on Ichigo's face grew wider and he gently rubbed the girl's head, ruffling her hair in the process. Yeah, sorry about that. So, how are you doing? Rurokiyo formed a neutral expression and sat on the edge of Ichigo's bed. She shrugged. I'm okay, I guess. Rurokiyo-sama is just worried that from now on, she won't be able to meet you as often as she had till now. A voice said from behind the door, causing Rurokiyo to grow beet red and jump down from Ichigo's bed. Giving him a short glance, she quietly yelped and ran out of the room. With a big smile, Ichigo waved after her. You didn't have to be so mean, Kenryu. He said. A moment later, said man walked inside the room. For a while, he stood silent, but then, all of a sudden, he dropped on his knees and bowed all the way to the ground. From the bottom of my heart, I thank you for helping us, Kurosaki Ichigo. Words alone aren't enough to describe the gratitude I feel. It was Ichigo's time to grow red. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was mortified. It's alright. Really? Just stand up, Kenryu. Ever so slowly, the man complied. I mean me and Inryu, are forever in your debt. You didn't just save Rurokiyo-sama, you also managed to melt her heart and open her emotions once again. Ichigo had to avert the man's gaze. It was just too honest. If you want to thank me, just take good care of her. And tell her I'll visit her whenever I get the chance. From the corner of his eyes, he saw Kenryu nod. We will. I swear on my life. Now, if you'll excuse me. Yeah, sure. The man turned around and prepared to leave, only to look over his shoulder once more. The Kazumioji clan will never forget your help, Kurosaki Ichigo. If you'll ever need something, well, you know where to find me. Then he walked out the doors. After he left, Ichigo released a long, drawn-out sigh. At that moment, all he wanted to do was to take a lengthy, hot shower, sprawl across the bed and sleep for as long as he could. Physically, he wasn't really that tired, the amount of energy he used up while in the Valley of Screams had been just normal. However, he was drained mentally. The amount of concentration it took for him to resist the attack of the Reishi in the valley had been beyond belief. Though, in his Quincy Spirit's words, it was not surprising. But as soon as he got up from the bed, another visitor prevented him from achieving his minuscule goal for the day. Kurosaki Ichigo, you've been summoned for the captain's meeting. Sighing in defeat, Ichigo's shoulders drooped. Just let me wash myself. Barely 20 minutes later, Ichigo was following the messenger's footsteps as they walked through a partially repaired barracks of the 1st Division. Both of them were completely silent, and so it was easy for Ichigo to hear a mixture of voices coming from behind a door the two of them were moving towards. It seemed the captain's meeting was already underway. When they reached the doors, the messenger raised his left arm and placed it in front of the teen. Wait here until given an order. Ichigo quietly nodded. Truth to be told, he was feeling quite nervous. He had already met in person most of the GODI 13 captains, but it was his first time meeting all of them at once and at such a formal occasion. The voices slowly grew quiet. Then, the doors opened and Ichigo was hit by a combination of Ryutsu. The captains were clearly keeping it low, but, at the same time, they weren't captains just for the show. The combination of their lowest Ryutsu states were enough to make Ichigo pause. He immediately knew his past self, from a few months ago, wouldn't have been able to take it. "Come in, Kurosaki Ichigo." He recognized Yamamoto's voice and hurriedly complied. With several steps, he strode into the hall while looking around himself. At the same time, he tried to ignore the multitude of intense gazes directed at him. Only one person wasn't doing that, and Ichigo immediately knew it was his father. Kurosaki Ichigo. Ichigo raised his head and looked at the commander, who stood right in front of him. With his old visage and a cane supporting him, he didn't really look like much of a threat, but Ichigo now knew that it was just a mask, a disguise to fool the enemy. "I called you here for several reasons. First and foremost, I hereby acknowledge your actions of the past few weeks that have not only helped uncover a serious treachery but also helped prevent a large-scale disaster." The teen had to blink several times in order to get over the surprise. He had expected anything but not quite this. Thanks." Some captains quietly chuckled, while some pressed their lips in disapproval. Yamamoto was in the second group. "Captain Shiba, I hope you will educate your son in proper protocol as soon as possible," the commander said. From the row on his right, a voice answered him. Sure." The amount of chuckles increased. Those who didn't laugh resorted to a deep sigh. At the same time, the sense of a formal pressure within the room slowly lessened. Ichigo was still fairly stunned, but a small smile still found its way on his face, causing Yamamoto to shake his head. "Moving on. Considering your involvement in several past incidents, along with the statement from Captain Amagai and also the reports of your progress in the Shino Academy, I came to a decision concerning your position within Seirai. Ichigo narrowed his eyes in slight confusion, what prompted Yamamoto to continue. "I'm sure you are aware of the current state of the GODI 13. It is imperative to return it to its full power as soon as possible. Therefore, you will no longer attend the Shino Academy. Instead, at the soonest date, you will undergo a special examination and immediately join the ranks of the GODI 13. Leaning a bit backwards, Ichigo formed a disbelieving expression. What? Sir. I realize this is unprecedented, but the situation is dire and you are one of the most promising students Seirai has ever seen. You are already leagues beyond your schoolmates' capabilities. If the situation was any else, you would remain in the academy at least until the end of the school year. However, considering everything, it would be unwise and ineffective to leave you there." Million thoughts exploded within Ichigo's mind, and it took him a lot of willpower to not freak out. Forcing himself to stay as calm as possible, he focused his concentration on the first thing that occurred to him. His head snapped to the right and he stared straight into Amagai's eyes. The man met his gaze with a slick grin. "Just so you know, Kurosaki Ichigo, Captain Amagai's statement about you was not the only one I heard today. Several other captains also spoke of your capacity, competence and potential power." When Yamamoto said that, Ichigo's emotions changed. He looked over the rest of the captains with a fairly surprised stare that betrayed his amazement. The thoughts in his mind slowly receded into the back of his head and allowed him to see clearly. Ichigo blinked. For a moment, he almost felt angry, but then he realized the situation was actually good for him. All of it just caught him off guard and mentally unprepared. I see. Thank you, sir." He cleared his throat and looked back at the commander with a lot more confidence than before. "If I may ask, which division?" Yamamoto slightly shook his head. "It has not been decided as of yet. It is often a tradition that graduates can pick their desired division, but I'm afraid you will not be given that choice. The balance of the GODI 13 is more important." Strangely, Ichigo wasn't really disappointed. Maybe it was because he hadn't thought of his desired division yet, or maybe he just agreed with the commander. He wasn't sure. "I understand, sir." Yamamoto gave a short nod. "Very well. You may leave now, Kurosaki. Taking a deep breath, Ichigo did just that. For a while, Yamamoto watched him leave, but, when the doors closed after the teen, he tapped the floor and glanced in Amagai's direction. Now then, let us return to our previous topic. Captain Amagai. Amagai met his gaze. Regarding your punishment, first, your privileges and authority over your division will be, for the foreseeable future, drastically reduced. You will share most of them with your vice-captain Kira Izuru. Though I am afraid it means he must be informed of some of the details you probably didn't want him to know. With a somber expression, Amagai curtly shook his head. That is all right. I had a fairly long conversation with him and we came to an understatement. He already knows most of it. After a few seconds of silence, Yamamoto continued. Very well. Moving on, your movement will be restricted to only Siraidii. Additionally, your actions will be monitored by members of the 2nd Division. Any attempt at shaking off your monitor will be reported. If such thing repeats itself, an electronic monitor will be sealed onto your body. All of these restrictions apply for the foreseeable future. In case of an emergency, they will be nullified for its whole duration. Amagai silently nodded. There wasn't really any space for him to protest. After everything he had done, he was well aware the punishment was all but deserved, even if surprisingly light. Yamamoto tapped the floor again and turned his attention to the other captains. Any objections? There was none. Satisfied, Yamamoto's eyes quickly shifted to the man standing in the row on his left, at its end. Captain Kurotsuki. I believe you have something. The man in question stepped up. Yes, thank you, Commander. He said and paused for a moment. It seemed as if he was organizing his thoughts. Concerning the Bakuto of Captain Amagai, I have no new information. As the captain himself confirmed, my guess about the sword's special properties were right, and it proved to be a crucial key in stopping the threat of the Valleys of Screams. Therefore, I will be researching it very closely. It will also take more time. Yamamoto nodded. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Amagai shifting uncomfortably, as if the lack of his second sword made him feel restless. With your permission, I also want to start a research on the Valleys of Screams. The data we had on them turned out to be insufficient, and so I will gather some more. It may prove useful in the future. The commander's eyes opened a tiny bit, showing his slight surprise. It was extremely rare for the captain of the 12th Division to actually ask permission for something. However, as much as he tried to, Yamamoto couldn't see any trick or weird angle in the man's request. Very well, I allow it. Mayuri grinned a bit. Thank you. Now, for the last and the most interesting part. As I mentioned to you a few times, I keep some of the files Urahara Kisuke left on his computers within the 12th Division. After discovering the data pertaining the death of your former subordinate, Shinetsuki Saragi, I took another look at those files. To my surprise, thanks to the recent advancements in technology, I managed to uncover some incredibly well-hidden notes about the Hogyaku he had created. He said and paused for a short moment. His grin also faded and was replaced with a grimace. The existence of these notes isn't surprising. Urahara Kisuke openly admitted creating the thing. However, the interesting but also infuriating thing is that the files have been accessed before I uncovered them. On the other hand, it happened only recently. Taking into account the access timestamp on the files and also other circumstances, I think I know who accessed them. Aizen Sosuke. The mood in the room changed instantly. Several small bursts of riot forced Yamamoto to tap the ground once more. Are you sure about this, Captain Kurotsuki? Mayuri nodded. Absolutely. On the Sokioku Hill, Aizen Sosuke said he managed to sneak into my laboratory and search it. This also leads me to another thing. The notes. They are encrypted with multiple layers of protection, but I fear Aizen Sosuke did break through them. What's in the notes? Before Mayuri could answer, another person entered the conversation. Ishine. If I may. Everyone looked at Ishine in surprise. Yamamoto nodded to him. Captain Shiba. Ishine cleared his throat. Urahara Kisuke told me about those notes. They contain not just any information about the Hogyaku. They are in a rough form, but they contain data on the thing's creation. Namely, the hypotheses about the components needed to create it. They also mention the fact that Urahara's Hogyaka was imperfect in how he proposed to complete it. He explained and glanced in Mayuri's direction. The scientist gave a short nod. I suspected as much. Also, Ishine continued and looked at every captain. Urahara is almost completely sure Aizen has his own, imperfect, Hogyaku. Silence in the room was deafening. Yet he still went to great lengths to try and get his hands on the other Hogyaku. And when he failed, he wasn't bothered because of the notes he had found before. It's almost as if he thought he could use the other Hogyaku for perfecting his own. As if the other Hogyaku was the key, but, at the same time, it wasn't. Mayuri quietly said, causing one of Yamamoto's eyelids to twitch. Those are just assumptions, though, am I right, Captain Kuratsuki? Mayuri's grimace turned unpleasant. For now. Sprawled across the bed in his academy room, Ichigo stared at the ceiling with a dull expression on his face. Funnily enough, now that he was finally alone, he didn't have the energy to even think. Aside from breathing and occasionally swallowing his saliva, he just lay there doing absolutely nothing. He just felt so exhausted. Mentally and, because of that, also physically. So much had happened in the recent weeks. He couldn't count everything even if he tried to. Although some incidents stood out more than the others, none actually mattered that much. At least not at the present moment. One of his eyelids twitched and a stray thought rushed through his mind until that minuscule amount of energy he could still feel within his body caught it and processed it. But it took him a few seconds of analyzing it before its meaning became clear enough for him to confront it. So I'm finally going to be in the Godai 13. While the thought had filled him with many emotions back at the captain's meeting, it now did almost nothing. The only thing he felt now was melancholy, not unlike the one that had squashed him when he had been trapped in the Valley of Screams. And similar to that moment, he didn't know what to do about it now as well. Or maybe he knew and just didn't have the energy to fight it. Why did I want to join the Godai so much, actually? He was fairly sure there was some kind of distant memory that tied him to that desire, but he just couldn't recall it. His brain was full of so much, it actually felt overstuffed. Bits and pieces of information seemed to be leaking out of it, almost as if the brain itself tried to reduce the load, lessen the burden. His past was slowly disappearing, unneeded, unwanted. It was for the best. The past couldn't be changed no matter how hard he would try, so it was best to just let go of it. So far, holding to it had caused him only pain and discomfort. Pain. As soon as he muttered that, Ichigo felt a sharp pain in his heart. It hurt so much, it forced his tired body to move and he clutched his chest. But the pain wasn't physical. It wasn't in that muscle that was beating deep in his chest. He knew it. Somehow he knew it. It wasn't his physical heart that hurt. It was his spiritual heart. The heart that encompassed all that he was. A man. A human. A Shinigami. A hollow. A Quincy. His eyes opened wide as if struck by a lightning. Suddenly, it made sense. He remembered. He recalled. He didn't forget. He couldn't. His past made him what he was today. It was an important part of his soul and he just couldn't let go of it. He wouldn't. Doing it would mean he no longer valued what he was. Who he was. What he represented. What he promised. That's right. I promised a certain girl I would do everything in my power to change things. The energy embraced him like a little sister would embrace her brother and set him on ease. Immediately, he got up and bolted to the shower. He needed cold water to fully wake up from something he never wanted to fall into again. Once he was done, he changed his clothes and walked to the door. He knew where he needed to go. In order to strengthen his hold on his past, to make it a permanent part of him, he needed to see it again in person. He needed it to regain what he almost lost. His goal. 3 days later, Shino Academy. It was 8 in the morning when a clean and fresh Ichigo walked out of his room and closed the door behind him. The expression on his face was neutral, but there was a hint of emotion in his eyes. Melancholy he had felt 3 days ago was clearly gone. Instead, it was replaced with confidence. A sort of excited anxiety. He didn't get to take even 10 steps before a familiar voice called out to him. "Long time no see, Ichigo." A small, raven-haired woman appeared in front of him. Seeing her brought a small smile to the teen's face. "I'm happy to see you too, Rukia." "He? Are you really?" Ichigo blinked. There was some definite undertone in Rukia's voice. It took him several long seconds of staring at her to identify it. As soon as he did, though, he creased his brow and pressed his lips together. "Sorry." The two of them had started to investigate the Kazumioji conspiracy together, but, in the end, Ichigo had left her out of it. Not by a choice, but, nevertheless, it had happened. Looking at him with a searching gaze, Rukia's grumpy grimace slowly turned neutral. "Well, as long as you understand." Silently, with their gazes only, they formed a mutual agreement and began walking to the academy side by side. "In case you are wondering why I'm here, I was asked to oversee your examination." Ichigo's head snapped towards her. "Ah, damn. I thought you didn't know. I kind of wanted to surprise you." After a few seconds of silence, Ichigo cracked his neck joints. "I don't suppose you know the contents of the examination." Rukia glanced at him with her neutral expression. For a moment, she cracked a sly grin. "Even if I did, I wouldn't tell you." Figures. Soon, they passed the main building and took a side path that stretched along the whole academy. There was only a minimal amount of students around that area, as most of them were confined either within the building's area or within the regular training grounds. "Say, Ichigo, this morning I heard a report that mentioned somebody making a small scene at the outer part of the Rokanga." Rukia suddenly said in a quiet tone. "MMM. You wouldn't know anything about it, would you?" "MMM." She stopped walking. After taking a few more steps, Ichigo did too, although it was accompanied with a deep and heavy sigh. "Ichigo." The teen chuckled and looked at her over his shoulder. "I just needed to remind myself something, Rukia. Don't worry about me." He saw Rukia biting her lower lip. It looked like she really wanted to say something but was debating with herself whether she should or shouldn't. She decided against it. "All right. If you say so." With a reassuring smile, Ichigo gave her a short nod. "Thanks." 15 minutes later, after arriving at the place where his examination would take place and greeting all the proctors, Rukia left Ichigo's side and went to the corner to watch him perform. Taking a seat, Ichigo grabbed the paper in front of him. It seemed the examination would consist of multiple tests. A written test. A physical evaluation test. A mental fortitude evaluation test. A Kido evaluation test. A combat performance evaluation test. Ichigo steeled his concentration and looked at the first question in the first portion of the examination, the written test. Each of the 13 divisions in Godi 13 have their own symbol which represents the division's primary role. Each symbol has a specific meaning. List these meanings and, in your own words, describe the correlation between them and the roles of the corresponding divisions. Narrowing his eyes, Ichigo put the paper down. "Well, this is going to be a lot more difficult than the entrance exam." Same day, evening. Seated in a comfortable chair, Ichigo finished his monologue and glanced at the person sitting in front of him, the vice captain of the 10th Division, Rangiku. In response, Rangiku formed an encouraging smile. "Very good. Anything else?" Ichigo squirmed a little bit and scrunched up his nose. "Me and Rukia, well, she probably thinks I tried to push her away. I mean I did, but not consciously. I was just so busy I didn't have any chance to talk to her about anything." Ranjiku's smile didn't leave her face. "Don't worry about Kukiki-san. After everything you have told me about her, as a fellow woman, I think I understand her a little. She's most likely just worried that you are trying to carry the weight of your troubles all by yourself." Ichigo stared at her for a while. What Rangiku said kind of made sense even to him. "I guess." A brief but comfortable silence fell upon the room, until Rangiku shifted her weight on the chair. "If that is all, then I think I have something to tell you, Ichigo." Ichigo nodded but stayed silent. Rangiku replaced her encouraging smile with a warm, motherly smile. "You've made great progress so far, Ichigo. If I compare you with the teen that first walked in these doors, well, the difference is huge. You've overcame your worst fears and managed to get through many steps towards being healed. I'm very proud of you. Ichigo couldn't help himself and averted Ranjiku's gaze. After all those therapy sessions, he came to see the usually lazy and easygoing vice captain as someone special to him. Her true nature, caring and warm, slowly grew on him. She had been a tremendous help, and her soothing words turned his deep, bleeding wounds into closed scars. Thank you, he whispered. Now, I think you are ready for the next step. Of course, you don't have to take it yet. It'll be your decision. He took a deep breath and looked back at Ranjiku. Tell me. Ranjiku nodded and slowly stood up. She motioned him to do the same. When they stood facing each other, Ranjiku looked at him with a quite serious expression. Ichigo, this is the next step. It's about overcoming your fear of touch. I want you to walk to me and hug me tightly. Staring at her in shock, Ichigo didn't move an inch. He was having great troubles translating her words into something he could understand. But then, he forced his mind to work again. He hadn't been attending the sessions just to freeze like that again. However, even if he wanted to take the next step, even if he was completely sure of himself, it was all just in his mind. His body was a different matter. No matter how much he tried, his body remained unresponsive. It almost caused him to growl. Move, damn it! He mentally yelled, but to no avail. It frustrated him to no end. If this was Rukia, I'd have no problems at all. Just because Matsumoto-san has large breasts doesn't mean I'm going to die. Listen to me, body. Nothing will happen if I touch her. Almost as if she was aware of his inner turmoil, Ranjiku said nothing. She just stood there and watched him struggle. She could help him, but it would have served no purpose. If he couldn't overcome his fear by himself, nobody could do it for him. Ichigo felt like plucking his hair. His breathing grew fast and he felt his heart beating like crazy. It was in that moment he realized his mistake. He was trying to force it. To go against himself. Once he was aware of it, he changed his tactic. He stopped mentally yelling and took several deep, calming breaths. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. The magic of slow, controlled breathing showed its teeth soon enough, and, a few moments later, Ichigo began to feel a twitch in his knees. After that, the twitch came from the toes on his feet. Then his legs' muscles. He closed his eyes and tried to go with the flow. The spiritual energy within him was a river and he was the one guiding it. His emotions were fire and he was their god. To him, they were something he could control. He opened his eyes and exhaled one more time. Then, he took the first step. Then the second. The third. Fourth. The fifth was the last, and he stopped only a few inches away from a smiling Ranjiku. Slowly raising his arms, he fought the last battle and struggled to bend his elbows. Then it came. He made it. He hugged her. The soft body pressing into him made him stop, but only for a split second. He neither hurled nor barfed. He didn't even feel disgust. The only thing he felt was joy. He did it. He won. A lone tear formed in his eye. It was exactly 2 days later that Ichigo got a memo about the results of his special examination. He had just woken up from a rather peaceful sleep only to find a hell butterfly flying above his head. Once he sleepily stuck out his arm and let the butterfly land on it, he heard a short message that served as an ice-cold wake-up call. It seemed he would receive his results from the Captain Commander himself. In person and in his office. Strangely, Ichigo wasn't that happy about it. Instead, a frown formed on his face. He watched the hell butterfly leave with a disgruntled gaze. He was aware that he was probably one of the few, if not the only, student that was given such honor. To hear the results from the commander. However, Ichigo wasn't honored. A sigh escaped his mouth. Not to be ungrateful or anything, but I'd like to hear it from my instructors. To Ichigo, getting this honor meant one thing. He was further being cast out as someone not normal and out of the ordinary. He was being treated in a special way. And being special was the last thing he wanted to be. He shook his head. Well, I guess I can't always get what I want. After freshening himself up with a lukewarm shower, he was flooded with his memories that caused him to correct his previous statement. That makes it sound like I get my way often. Which is completely bogus. He put his clothes on, grabbed his Zanpakuto and then slapped his face with his right hand. And why the hell am I talking to myself? It's like I'm nervous or something. Heh. He chuckled. Then he almost slipped because his hand missed the door handle. Closing his eyes, he sighed and took a deep breath. Only when he was sure he wouldn't trip on his own legs he opened the door and walked out. An uneventful trip across Siriti later, when he stood in front of the commander's office, he took another deep breath. He knocked and slowly opened the doors. "Ah, Kurosaki Ichigo, come in." With a short nod, the teen closed the door behind him and strode towards the commander. Seated behind his table, the commander motioned Ichigo to sit down and then reached for the stack of papers placed on the edge of his table. "You know why you're here, Kurosaki Ichigo, so I'll skip the formalities. What I have here are the results of your examination," Yamamoto said and placed his index finger on the uppermost paper. Fighting the urge to look at it, Ichigo kept his gaze at the man. "I realize this must seem odd, to receive such a thing from me, but there is a reason behind it," Yamamoto continued, unknowingly answering one of the questions that plagues the teen's mind. "The current state of the Godi 13, coupled with the current situation, makes me want to keep a close eye on certain things. Most of the time, I don't care whom my captains accept into their divisions. However, in your case, I'm interested." Ichigo shifted in his seat. "In my case?" Yamamoto put his hand under his chin and slightly opened his eyes, making Ichigo feel smaller than he actually was. "Aside from Kido, you passed your other tests with relatively high to extremely high score. Even then, your Kido score was low only in the practical part. What makes me interested in your case, is the potential of your power," the commander said and then glanced on a different paper. "I read all the reports in which you were mentioned. Despite being a beginner, you fought the Bounce multiple times. Even before that, you fought and defeated an elusive hollow called Grand Fisher. You fought Minos Grande. You fought the Kazumioji clan assassins. In the span of the few months you've been in the Soul Society, you fought many battles, yet you came on top in each and every one of them." He looked back at Ichigo. "Even if you are Captain Shiba's son, these accomplishments are not ordinary. Even I admit that much. Combat-wise, you are already more experienced than most of low-seated officers. Power-wise, you may generally be stronger than most of the seated officers. However, it's clear as a day that you are not a captain or a vice-captain material just yet. These positions are about more than just raw power. Therefore, you will be appointed as a third seat." Yamamoto continued to look at Ichigo, and when he saw the teen's reaction, he leaned into his chair. "You seem surprised, Kurosaki Ichigo." Ichigo quickly shook his head and tried to erase his current expression. "No, I'm just. I didn't expect you to praise me." For an instant, it looked as if the commander grinned. It may have been just an optical illusion coming from the stray sunray. "I'm not praising you, Kurosaki. You are far too much of a troublemaker for that. You lack delicacy, foresight, manners, and many more, but that can be written off as something you'll get in time. You are still very young." Ichigo swallowed the bittersweet taste in his mouth and narrowed his eyes a little. "You said third seat, does that mean you have already decided which division I'll be in?" One of Yamamoto's eyelids twitched, but he answered as if nothing happened. "Indeed. Truth be told, I have received messages from many of my captains who would like to have you in their divisions. However, I have to think about the whole Godi 13, and so, to balance the distribution of power, I decided on one division," he said and placed a small paper in front of Ichigo. The teen quickly looked at it. The first thing that hit him was a large insignia of a white poppy. Underneath it was written a single word. "Oblivion. I decided that from now on, you will be a third seat of the 9th Division. Their mission is to protect Siriti. It is always on standby for combat because it is the security force of the Godi 13. I don't think I have to explain my reasoning, as you yourself are someone who is seemingly always ready to protect and defend. And you seem to have the knack for finding combat." Ichigo listened to him in silence. He wasn't sure how he felt about it just yet. However, he knew Yamamoto wasn't wrong. Moreover, the word oblivion somehow felt right. Fitting. He was so immersed in his own thoughts, he didn't even hear the doors to the office open and then close. Only when he heard an unfamiliar voice that he jerked and looked up. There was a tall and lean-built man with dark gray eyes, short black hair and 3 scars straight over his right eye that led down his cheek, standing right next to him. Additionally, the man had the number 69 tattooed on his left cheek, as well as a blue striped tattoo that ran across his left cheek and over the bridge of his nose. He was wearing a sleeveless shiakusho, a choker around his throat and matching armbands on both upper arms. All in all, the man had a somewhat punk-like appearance. Kurosaki Ichigo, this is the vice captain of the 9th Division, Shihei Hisagi. Walking out of the office almost an hour later, Ichigo felt very good. He felt good about himself, about his new placement in the Godiai and also about the 9th Division itself. Until this day, the only thing he knew about it was that, in the past, it used to be led by one of the 3 captains that had fled the Soul Society. Namely, Kaname Tison. And that didn't really make him like the division. It wasn't out of prejudice, though. Just an innate feeling. Even meeting the vice captain, Hisagi, didn't change his opinion of the 9th Division. At least not immediately, as Hisagi's appearance was anything but comforting. However, the more Ichigo spoke with the man, the better his opinion of him became. At first glance, Hisagi seemed like a person Ichigo wouldn't probably hang out with, but in reality, underneath his appearance, Hisagi was actually the opposite. Mature and calm, the vice captain of the 9th Division gave out the vibe of honor, virtue even. When he spoke about the 9th Division, it was as if he was describing his family, a close gathering of comrades he would give his life for. That compassion didn't stop at the borders of his division, though. It encompassed the whole Godiai 13, and Hisagi considered every single member as an important link of chain. All in all, Ichigo didn't think he could have ended up in a better division. I got to hand it to the commander. He knows the Godiai well. He thought appreciatively. Congratulations, Kurosaki. The sudden voice coming from behind him caused the hair on his neck to stand up. He recoiled and quickly looked over his shoulder. Damn it! He wheezed. Standing there was the captain of the 2nd Division, Sui Feng. She watched his reaction with a slightly amused expression. At least that's how it looked like to Ichigo. It was hard to tell with Sui Feng. You ought to get used to it, Kurosaki. Freaking out like this could get you killed. Ichigo sighed and tried to calm his furiously beating heart. I'll keep that in mind, Captain. You heard about my new position already. Yes. Sui Feng nodded and then motioned him to follow her out of the 1st Division compound. Once they were out, she led him to a secluded part of Siraidai, where nobody seemed to be. Only when they were there that she turned to him again. Somehow, Ichigo had a feeling he knew what she was about to say. Your face tells me you know what this is about, Kurosaki, so I'll cut to the chase. Now that you are a part of the Godiai 13, my offer from before has finally more weight. What do you say, Kurosaki? Will you help me keep the Soul Society secure and act as my hidden proxy within the Godiai? Ichigo closed his eyes. He was right. It was exactly what he thought she would ask. But it was fine. Unlike the first time when she had given him the offer, he now knew what his answer was going to be. Somewhere in Hueco Mundo. Only one thing illuminated a fairly large room with 3 occupants. It was a small, translucent orb, roughly the size of a golf ball, but even on first glance, it looked otherworldly. The bluish-purple color of the substance floating within it was mesmerizing, yet terrifying. One of the men put the empty vials in his hand away and slowly placed the same hand on the orb. When he closed his eyes, it looked like his whole being became denser. The other 2 men just watched him from a short distance. Then it happened. The orb exploded in a brilliant flash of bright color, and the whole room was momentarily filled with a spiritual energy so strong, yet so ethereal, it felt like a presence of a god. With a large smile, the man slightly turned and glanced at his 2 companions. Jin, Kaname, as you can see, everything is still going according to the plan. The arrows we harvested from the young Quincy archer truly were the last answer. The desired output lasts only for a while, but, For that time frame, the Hogyaku can definitely be activated. What now, Captain Aizen? The man in question, Aizen Sosuke, raised his hand from the Hogyaku and smiled even further. Now? Now we proceed to the next stage. It is time to get to work. Nodding, Jin and Kaname both turned to leave the room, only to be stopped a moment later. Jin, tell Ulquiorra and Yami to be on a standby. Kaname, please tell Neutra and Sailaporo I want to speak with them about something. Captain Aizen. Aizen's smile turned into a grin. Oh, don't worry, it's something from the past I'd like to recover. Chapter 26, Doomsday, Beginning. A little piece of heaven. When I died, I was told the Soul Society is something akin to a paradise, where 9 out of 10 times it is better than the living world and hunger is never a problem. I admit, hearing that calmed me down a bit. It certainly is good to tell the recently deceased a gentle lie, so he wouldn't be scared. But it's just that. A lie. A beautiful lie. Soul Society is a paradise? Not in the slightest. Only a masochist, or a person blind to the reality could honestly believe in such a thing. Soul Society is anything but paradise. It is a limbo, a never-ending cycle of humility in a place that surely isn't better than the living world in 9 out of 10 times. Those of you living in Siriti will never read past these lines because to you, I'm saying heretical things, nonsense, and just plain lies. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been in Rokanga? In its outer parts? Parts where the Shinigami laws are treated as jokes. A place filled with pain, suffering and irrationality? If you can answer yes and still treat my words as lies, then immediately stop reading. I have nothing to say to you. A soul does not feel hunger. It does not feel thirst. Yet people of Rokanga are always hungry or thirsty. Despite that, food or water does not satisfy them. Their needs are different. Separated from the limbo, they live in perpetual hell. A place where murder is treated as breakfast, rape as lunch, torture as dinner and anything else, possibly pleasant, as dessert. But that dessert is just an illusion. Something that will never come. I've seen it with my own eyes and felt it with my own flesh. It is mind-consuming. Soul-corroding. It's something I wish was never a part of my past. Stay there and you will never return. Even if by some miracle you do, you don't. What will return is no longer the you your friends know. It'll be just a shell, a container for a soul without any purpose. I was fortunate. I stayed there, yet I survived. Irreparably changed and inevitably corroded, but I survived. Yes, I may be painting an image with a color that is darker than black. All it takes is to take a look around. Not a single thing I mentioned is present in Siriti. Maybe that is the root of the problem. Nobody sees the truth here. I don't blame them. It is easy to lose yourself in the peace and calm. I do that sometimes myself. But then, the memories come back. To haunt me, to torment me but also, to remind me of my goal. That goal is to change the Soul Society into a place that can truly be called a paradise. Is that a naive dream? Maybe it is. What do I know? However, I will certainly try to make it happen so. With all of my strength and all of my power, until the end of times. I may be an idiot. But, a smart person would never even try. Ichigo stared at the words he had just written with a large frown on his face. He read the lines over and over again, in hopes he would find something he had missed or a part that didn't sound that good to him anymore. Eventually though, he admitted defeat. His words came straight out of his heart and no matter how many times he would read them, he could never not agree with them. Done. Ichigo looked up, at the man with a punkish appearance, and nodded. Yeah, I think so. He said after a moment and leaned into his chair, thinking about the past 2 weeks since he became a third seat of the 9th Division. During that time, he found out many things. About himself, about the 9th Division, their ideology and, most importantly, about the vice captain who stood next to him, Hisagi. Hisagi was exactly as Ichigo thought he would be after meeting him in the office of Captain Commander. Maybe even more. Simply put, Hisagi felt human. Like a complete person that had good points but also faults. Because of that, Ichigo found the time he had to spend with him as not completely wasted. Since the 9th Division was void of its captain's position, most of the paperwork was Hisagi's and now also Ichigo's responsibility. It was a lot of mechanical work, but the two of them passed the time by having small talks about many different topics. This way, Ichigo discovered that the 9th Division had one additional responsibility. That responsibility was called the Siriti Communication, and, being a person who liked literature, Ichigo quickly offered to be a part of the staff. The Siriti Communication was a magazine released in Soul Society with the purpose of raising morale and building solidarity among Shinigami. I like it. It's harsh, but you can feel the emotions behind it, Hisagi suddenly said, waking Ichigo from his thoughts. The teen sheepishly rubbed his head. Thanks, Hisagi-san. Though I guess we'll have to come up with a name for your column if you want to do this regularly. Hisagi looked at him with a thoughtful gaze, half asking, half stating. I'd like to. It's a good way to tell the thoughts I want others to hear. Matsumoto-san thinks it's a good idea too. Yep, we're definitely doing it. Hisagi said almost immediately, causing a small grin to form on Ichigo's face. It took him only 2 weeks to realize that if he really wanted something from his vice-captain, he only needed to mention one name. Alright, I'll ask Sunen whether we have any space left in this month's print. But I think it'll be definitely possible, now that we lost 3 large columns. Hisagi continued, his face slowly losing its emotions. Ichigo sighed. Hisagi-san. Inwardly, Ichigo released another sigh. Anytime Hisagi thought about the Sokioku Hill incident and about his former captain, he became melancholic. Not that Ichigo blamed him for that. He knew how hard it must have been on the man. However, Ichigo himself was susceptible to melancholy, and so, seeing Hisagi like that was like looking in the mirror. How about a spar? Writing for so long kind of made my neck stiff. Hisagi blinked and some of his emotions returned. Sure. I'll just send your paper and my work to the editing department. 15 minutes later, in one of the 9th Division's training grounds, Ichigo stood face to face with his vice-captain. Ready to begin the spar, they both tightened the grip on their Zanpakuto. Ichigo even more so, as there was one more thing he had learned since becoming the 3rd seat. One should never underestimate Hisagi. Go. Anticipating Hisagi's first move, Ichigo immediately took a quick step backwards and watched a blade narrowly missing the tip of his nose. The teen mentally sighed in relief and, using his Zanpakuto, harshly batted the blade away. You're not holding back. Great. He muttered and briefly recalled his first spar with Hisagi. It ended with the teen's crushing defeat in barely 1 second. The last time I held back, you almost wiped the floor with me, Kurosaki. I never make the same mistake twice. Hisagi retorted with a serious gaze and stroke again. As soon as he saw the blade coming at him, Ichigo put his weight into his ankles and leaped over the vice-captain. Mid-air, he tried to slash the man's shoulder. Hisagi didn't waste a single movement and fluidly changed the trajectory of his sword so it would clash with Ichigo's blade, preventing the teen from harming him. Once Ichigo's Zanpakuto slid along the edge of his sword, he grabbed the hem of Ichigo's sleeve and yanked him down, to the ground. Using every bit of his flexibility, Ichigo spun around and, before his body could hit the ground, he stabbed his Zanpakuto in it. However, while it prevented him from crashing, it also left him open for the attack. With that in mind, he quickly let go of the hilt of his sword and brought his hands to his chest. It was just in time as the sole of Hisagi's left foot immediately came at him with the intention of blasting him backwards. Ichigo was able to absorb most of the strike, but the stinging sensation in the palms of his hands was almost enough to make his hands go numb. Still, he didn't let go of Hisagi's foot and, straining his muscles, he twisted it around and with it forced Hisagi to do the same. As the vice-captain went along with it, since he didn't want his leg broken, Ichigo quickly reached for his Zanpakuto and yanked it from the ground. Back to square one, huh? Ichigo ignored the comment and kept his concentration at high alert. That he managed to hold his own for this long meant Hisagi would soon increase his pace. Truth to be told, barely a second after he thought that, he was forced to slowly back away from Hisagi, as the man unleashed a series of short but fast swipes that left almost no room for parrying. Ichigo knew if he tried to do that, he wouldn't be able to keep doing it for long. His Zanjutsu skills were good but not Hisagi good. Still, he was far too stubborn to just admit a defeat in a spar. While backing away, he watched Hisagi's every movement and waited. Occasionally, he dared to block a strike that got too close to hitting him, but what he tried to do the most was to analyze Hisagi's attack pattern. However, it soon dawned onto him. Whatever Hisagi's attack pattern was, it was far too complicated to analyze during action. Soon, Ichigo felt a few shallow cuts on his body. It caused him to narrow his eyes. Refusing to go down like that, he tightened his grip and, after he dodged another swipe, he brought his Zanpakuto down with all of his might. Whoa! The force behind the sword didn't allow Hisagi to continue his pattern as the shockwave swirled the dry soil and raised it high enough to create a weak smoke screen. Rushing through it, Ichigo appeared in front of squinting Hisagi and brought his Zanpakuto down on him. With no time to dodge, Hisagi had to parry the strike. A bit satisfied, Ichigo saw the surprise in the man's eyes when his arms shook under the weight of Ichigo's attack. Good strength, Kurosaki. It was Ichigo's turn to be surprised as Hisagi quickly overcame the weight and violently pushed him away. Almost thrown out of balance, Ichigo preventively jumped in the air. Despite that, he still felt the tip of Hisagi's blade tearing the fabric of his clothes. A weak breeze caressed the skin on his back and made his skin crawl. Too close. He brought his knees to his chin and rolled through the air. When he landed, he instantly spun around and slashed the air. His sword clashed with Hisagi's sword. He saw the man nodding. I think it's time to stop this spar. A bit winded, Ichigo raised one of his eyebrows. Only then he felt several different Ryotsu in his close proximity. He looked away from the vice-captain and saw a large group of men from the 9th Division watching them. Okay. Both of them slowly lowered their swords and then lightly bowed to each other. Good spar, Kurosaki. Ichigo heard weak clapping and a few catcalls coming from their audience and couldn't help but laughing. Thanks, Hisagi-san. Though, one day, I'd really like to force you into your Shikai. Hisagi finally cracked a friendly smile. You'll have to try harder than that, Kurosaki. And by the way, your new Shiakusho is waiting for you in the office. Later that day, Ichigo walked towards the Shino Academy feeling quite conscious of himself. The reason for that feeling was the new set of clothes he was now, as the member of the Godai 13 and the member of the 9th Division, obligated to wear. Most of the clothes were just ordinary pieces of Shinigami Shiakusho that every Shinigami wore, but there was one difference after all. Since it was something of an unspoken tradition, every member of the 9th Division wore a sleeveless kosid instead of a normal one. Too shy to show some skin. Ichigo ignored the tone of his Zanpakuto spirit's voice and mentally shook his head. Nah, I just feel a bit vulnerable, I guess. I'm sure I'll be fine in a day or two. He thought and silently entered the academy through its front doors. Oh yeah, remind me again, why are we here? Ichigo waited with the answer until the group of students politely greeting him passed him by. I thought I'd like to learn some new stuff, but the division's library has quite the limited selection of books. He thought. After exchanging a few words with one of the instructors, he heard his Zanpakuto spirit talking again. Really? And how about, trying to master me and my abilities? And mine too. Sod off, old man. I'm more important. Ichigo couldn't take it and released an exasperated sigh. He didn't like when his spirits argued. It always caused a throbbing headache that wouldn't go away for almost a whole day. Rubbing his head, he formed a small frown. I plan on doing that too. With both of you. I just felt like using my brain again. Hey. What's that supposed to mean? Ichigo inhaled. Deeply. Come on. You know what I meant. A few moments later, he heard a disgruntled grunt. That doesn't mean I'm happy about it. I want you to use me as much as you, okay? That came out wrong. Fine, I get it. Go ahead and study your stupid books. Ichigo almost chuckled out loud. Thanks Zanjutsu, you're the best. Fuck off. In a visibly better mood, Ichigo didn't pay enough attention to his surroundings and almost crashed into a petite student. Whoa, sorry about that, Ah, Kiraku-san. The student that bounced off him and barely kept her balance, was Yuno Kiraku, one of Captain Kiraku's nieces. Oh, Kurosaki-san, or should I say, third seat Kurosaki. Seeing her smiling expression, Ichigo shook his head in slight amusement. Kurosaki-san is still fine. Yuno's smile widened. Fancy meeting you here. I though you're busy with your new work. Congratulations to that, by the way. Thanks. I just wanted to grab some books from the library. He saw her tilting her head. I see. So you won't admit it by yourself. Ichigo blinked in surprise. Eh? What do you mean? The girl reached into one of her pockets and took out a small piece of paper. I mean this. Somebody put in a good word for me in the 4th Division and they accepted me to be a trainee for a few weeks. Ichigo intently stared at the paper, trying hard not to glance in Yuno's direction. But she kept her gaze glued on him until he backed down. Fine, I ended up in the 4th after a spar and, while I was being treated, I recalled you saying you'd like to become a medic and it just came out. I didn't really think they would listen to me. He admitted, briefly thinking back to a week earlier, when Kenpei Kazaraki had found him and had demanded a spar with him. Obviously, the spar had quickly become a survival of the fittest with both of them ending in the medical wing. That day, Captain of the 4th Division had been very unhappy. Don't worry, I'm not accusing you or anything. I'm actually happy that somebody cares enough to do such a thing for me. Yuno said and lightly patted his shoulder. Then, leaving him stumped, she walked away. I don't get it. Ichigo muttered to himself and tuned out his Zanpakuto spirit as soon as he felt him making some sort of a snarky remark. After that, he finally made his way to the library. Ichigo closed the last book on his table and leaned into his chair. He stretched his back but felt it wasn't enough to release all the tension from his body. Swiftly, he leaped into his bed and closed his eyes in an attempt to relax his stiff muscles and to absorb all the information he had just read. The books he had borrowed from the library were a bit different from books usually used in academy education and the knowledge in them was a lot more detailed and advanced. There isn't really much I can learn about Hakuda. It's mostly just mixed martial arts, though I could try to learn some of the special techniques. The only problem is, almost all of them require a better than good Ryu-Ryoku control. He thought while humming quietly. It still could be worth looking into. Turning his head left and right, he cracked the joints in his neck and an audible sigh of relief came out of his mouth. The loss of some tension felt good. Zanjutsu is another thing I can improve and only by practicing. Though I guess reading about it wasn't all that pointless. There are some good combinations in all those different sword styles. While I consider myself more of a react kind of guy, I suppose knowing a move or two won't hurt. Ichigo opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling with a thoughtful gaze. By raising his arms and stretching them towards the ceiling as much as he could, he felt some of the stress leaving his shoulders. However, the really interesting fact was the Ho-Ho section. In the academy, they simply told us that the evolved Hollows, Minos, could use fast movements comparable to those of a Shinigami. But I didn't know it also has a name. He let the arms fall down on the bed. So, Shinigami have Shunpo, Hollows have a technique called Sonido. I have a feeling Quincy have something similar as well, even though the book doesn't mention them at all. Your feeling is spot on, Ichigo. Ichigo barely batted an eye at the sudden voice within his mind. He had expected his Quincy spirit to react to that. Is it that similar? The technique Quincy use for movement is called Hirin-kyaku and it is similar to Shunpo and Sonido only in the sense of it being a high-speed movement technique. Also, while I understand your thirst for knowledge, I think it is not yet time for you to try and learn it, Ichigo. Waiwak replied in his usual, calm, demeanor. Why not? Hirin-kyaku requires the user to be extremely good in energy manipulation. To illustrate, you would need to be able to gather enough Reishi or Ryu-Ryoku under your feet that you could ride it to the desired location in an instant. For now, Shunpo is your best choice. Pressing his lips together, Ichigo formed a frown. I see. Alright. Next thing, Kido. Right now, I can efficiently use 4 Kido spells, 2 types of Bakudo and 2 of Heido. I am fairly content with that but I think some versatility would be nicer. Barrier spells are incredibly difficult, so I guess I'm stuck with either a new Bakudo or a new Hado. I can cause enough destruction already, so. Bakudo. The ones with higher numbers are very interesting but also hard to produce, and I think a spell with instant effect would be the best. He wondered and thought back to the blocks of text in the books. Let's see, Bakudo with the number 8 was called Saki, no, Seiki. It generates an orb of light blue energy which repels whatever strikes it. Sounds good. I could use it for a surprise block. With an affirmative nod to himself, he decided on the spell. Then he raised his head a little and glanced in the direction of the other books he had brought with him. Though I have to admit, it's really hard to find any book on information about the noble clans. Especially on what makes them so unique. Is it such a secret or? He didn't finish his thought. Instead, his frown deepened. 1,000 questions popped in his mind. Coming back from a lunch at the Kukaki Manor with Rukia and the captain of the 6th Division, Ichigo aimed his steps to one of the sturdier training areas the 9th Division had to offer. He was planning to train with his Zanpakuto, and so, keeping in mind his destructive capability and the warning from Hisagi he had gotten the last time, he chose to use the area which walls were coated with Sekizeki. Sekizeki was a special mineral with properties that allowed it to repel all Ryuryoku, making it incredibly useful for training where using large quantities of spiritual energy was involved. But even Sekizeki wasn't impenetrable, and a spiritual energy of sufficient density could potentially pass through, albeit with incredible difficulty. Good afternoon, 3rd Seat Kurosaka-san. Kurosaka-san. Ichigo nodded to the greeting of his fellow officers and watched them pass with a neutral expression. Men from the 9th Division liked him enough, but the teen felt some definite space between them. It wasn't just the formality or the military etiquette, though. They kept him far enough so they wouldn't get overly familiar with him. On one hand, it felt odd, but, on the other one, Ichigo knew he couldn't fault them. He was doing the same thing. When he finally entered the training area, he quickly grabbed the hilt of his Zanpakuto and took the sword out. With closed eyes, he took a deep breath. Feeling his Zanpakuto firmly in his hand was just so relaxing. Going for too long without it made his skin crawl. He didn't know the reason behind it, but he didn't care. The feeling of security and tranquility, that felt like a lullaby to him, almost ironically clashed with the power contained within the sword. Bleach their souls, Zanjitsu. He stated quietly. The rush of the increased flow of Ryuryoku was comparable to an adrenaline injection, given at the brink of death. It elevated his mood, his emotions, and also, his instincts. He felt like a predator on the hunt, ready to pounce on the closest prey. There was no mask fragment on his face. Ichigo consciously kept himself from releasing all the taps in his body, even though it was incredibly hard. The temptation to just let go was beyond belief. Now. I'm sure you want me to figure it out by myself, so I won't bother asking you a thing, Zanjitsu. He mentally said to his Zanpakuto spirit, who remained silent. Then he thought back to the time he had spent in the Valley of Screams. Back then, he had been sure he managed to produce something a bit different from his regular Getsuga, but, as the time passed, he got a bit skeptical. He glanced at his two-sword and frowned. So. Let's just try something. Focusing on his intention, he raised his swords and made 2 quick slashes, each one with a different blade. Getsuga Tensho. Getsuga Tensho. Before dispersing on the Sekizeki coating, the 2 beams of energy briefly illuminated the area, but the frown on the teen's face didn't change. Just regular Getsuga. He muttered. Maybe I need to fire them at the same time. He raised his swords again. Getsuga Tensho. Even though he yelled the name of the technique only once, Getsuga came out of from both blades. Ichigo's frown deepened. Then he cursed. I'm an idiot. If it's a different technique, it probably has a different name. Saying Getsuga Tensho is probably forcing this one to come out. With that in mind, he slashed the air again, this time without calling the name of the technique and just concentrating on his energy in hope it would do what he wanted it to do. Nope. He grunted and paused while staring at the wall in front of him. I'm definitely missing something. An hour later, he wasn't any closer to his goal. So far, he only spammed his regular Getsuga until he got to the point where the missing portion of his Ryoryoka finally got to him. His knees became water and he knew he had to take a breather. Ah, damn it. He sat on the ground, panting. It's no use. I'll try again tomorrow. Leaning backwards, he supported himself on his hands and looked up, at the sky. It was bright blue but there were some heavy clouds coming from a distance. Storm was definitely coming. Ichigo's face twisted into a deep frown. With a sigh, he straightened his back and sat in a meditative pose. He immersed himself into his own consciousness and slowly calmed his haggard breathing. His eyes were closed but he saw his surroundings with his imagination. It was like a surreal picture, painted by an artist who used an abstract thinking. Then, the dirt close to him began to glow and move towards him. Forming a trail of small particles, it turned into pure spiritual matter of light blue color. When it came in contact with the teen's body, it seemingly got absorbed. You are getting better at this, Ichigo. The praise made Ichigo happy but, since he didn't want to break his concentration, he didn't reply to his Quincy spirit. Instead, he just made sure the spirit could feel his emotions. Along with it, he sent him a peculiar mental picture. The spirit hesitated a little in his answer to that. Try it, was all Wiwak said to him. In reaction to that, Ichigo blindly moved his hands until he found the hilts of his swords and then grabbed them. Bit by bit, the spiritual matter that flowed into him from his surroundings changed its direction until it seemingly joined with the teen's arms. There, it changed color and then flowed into both swords. Slicing the air with them, Ichigo opened his eyes. Ow! The hell! Surprised by a sudden and sharp pain in his right arm, he let go of his bigger sword while a small but bright Getsuga shot off from the smaller blade. He quickly glanced at his right arm, only to see bruising and tiny cuts forming on his skin. The pain remained. GH, what's going on? You're a dumbass, that's what's going on. Think about what you just tried to do. While the voice of his Zanpakuto spirit didn't really sound angry, there was a lot of ire and exasperation in it, making Ichigo wince not just from the pain. The teen tried to block the sharp agony but found himself unable to do it as its intensity grew even more. A bit of blood came out from the cuts. However, as his spirits weren't freaking out or even bothered, Ichigo knew it couldn't have been that bad. In light of that, despite feeling as if thousands blades moved around in his arm, he stayed silent and just tried to wait through the pain. It turned out to be the right decision and, several seconds later, the arm stopped bleeding. The discomfort preserved but he could feel his regeneration kicking in. Only then he could try to do what his Zanpakuto spirit suggested. He thought about it. Focus on why this happened in your right arm only. What was the difference in your arms when you tried to do what you tried to do? His Quincy spirit quietly offered him a small hint. Ichigo narrowed his eyes and looked at both his hands. It took him a moment but he realized it. Swords. I held different swords. And Ichigo closed his eyes and formed a grimace. And I tried to use the reishi I gathered from my surroundings as the fuel for my Getsuga. And what kind of technique did you use for that? Reishi manipulation. And how can you do that? It finally hit him. Because I'm partly a Quincy and the larger sword is the representation of my Shinigami and hollow powers. Is that it? It felt like my arm got blown off. He heard a deep sigh coming from the depths of his mind. Ichigo, I once told you I don't like this old man that represents your Quincy powers. That's not completely true. It's not that I don't like him. It's the hollow part of my that can't stand him. Literally. He blinked in surprise. Ichigo. Hollows and Quincy do not mix. They are like a poison to each other. No, let me rephrase that. Hollows are a poison to Quincy. A very hurtful poison. On the other hand, Quincy are not a poison for hollows. They are just something that can completely eradicate hollows and leave no trace after them. So, what you did was to mix everything up. Never mix everything up because it creates a violent backlash. You hate that term, but if you weren't a hybrid being, an amalgam of every race, this backlash could kill you. A chill ran through Ichigo's spine. He gulped and placed his other sword on the ground. Some questions popped in his mind but he decided to put them away for now. He was far too disturbed to deal with them. Yeah, no more mixing things up. He slowly got up, only to hear a different voice coming from the training grounds entrance. "Hey, Ichigo, got a minute?" Inside the main building of the 9th Division, Ichigo motioned his visitor to sit down. "What's up, Renji?" The vice-captain of the 6th Division, Aburai Renji, sat in the offered chair but kept his gaze on the teen's fairly bloody right arm, prompting him to explain. "I just trained a bit too hard," Ichigo said dismissively and reached into a cabinet. He pulled a towel out of it that he quickly dipped into water and then used it to wipe the blood away. Once he did that, Renji finally opened his mouth. "Do you remember the new directive from a few days ago? The one that promotes the improvement of the inter-division cooperation?" Ichigo immediately nodded. "Yeah, I heard about it from Hisagi-san. Several weeks ago, when Minos Grande got to Siriti, the commander wasn't that thrilled with the level of cooperation between divisions, and this is the result of it." He put a glass of water in front of Renji, who gladly took a sip. "Right. Ever since it came into effect, groups of Shinigami from different divisions are being sent to the human world together for joint missions. Well, guess who got paired up this time?" Busy putting away the now dirty towel, Ichigo briefly didn't pay attention to the man, but, when silence fell on the room, he blinked and looked at the vice-captain. "Huh." Renji raised his right arm and, with index finger, pointed at the teen and then at himself. "Yep, we are going first thing in the morning." Sun barely popped from behind the horizon when a Senkaimon gate appeared in the middle of Karakura town. Two equally sleepy Shinigami came out of it while yawning and cracking their neck joints. "Man, I should have gone to bed earlier." "Me too." Renji glanced at the teen with a raised eyebrow. "Yesterday training?" Ichigo, still yawning, nodded. When the yawn subsided, he shuddered. "You?" Renji shrugged. "Got together with Ikeku-san and others from the 11th Division to talk about the old times. Of course, we ended up drinking. A lot," he said and briefly closed his eyes. The first rays of sunlight falling on his face caused him to wince. Ichigo snorted. "Why do you even drink if the mornings are so bad?" Renji raised one hand and, for a few seconds, stayed silent. "The trick is to never stop drinking." Another snort escaped Ichigo's nose. "Heh, you sound like Ikeku-san." "Well, it is his damn fault." The two of them glanced at each other and chuckled. "He's a bad influence all right." Renji lightly nodded. "That he is. Now come on, we should do the rounds." They spent the following few hours mostly in silence. They tried to focus on their mission as much as possible, and so the conversation was sparse and brief. However, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As soon as the 7th hour came, a mass of people began to move across the city in an effort to get to work in time. Kids and children hurried to their schools and the elderly leisurely strode to their favorite shops. Ichigo purposely averted the Karakura High School in fear of seeing some of his former classmates. He had already coped with the fact he was dead and that there was nothing he could do to change it. He had also accepted his past as the part of him, but, despite that, he somehow knew he didn't want to meet his former friends. It would still be very uncomfortable. Maybe moving subconsciously, he ended up in the Karakura Park where, a few weeks ago, he had fought against Hanzo. A place where he had lost control over himself and caused deaths of innocent people. To his surprise, he found the park completely reconstructed and rebuilt. It was almost as if his fight with the Kazumioji assassin never happened. As if it had happened only in his memory. Funny how this town deals with its past better than I do, he thought dryly. Renji tapped him on the shoulder. "I just got a memo that a group of students is somewhere in Karakura, so we shouldn't be surprised if we came across them. Some academy business." "Okay." They both turned around to go for another round when a weird feeling assaulted their senses. In that moment, a slight noise came from the sky, causing them to look up. Up in the sky, a small hole appeared out of thin air and two things shot out of it. Causing a small tremor, they seemingly crashed into the ground a few miles away from Ichigo and Renji's position. Not even a second later, a hollow riot pulsed across the whole area with great intensity. Ichigo and Renji exchanged looks. Neither spoke a word. They both realized it. Something was seriously wrong. In the next moment, they flashed away in a burst of shunpo. But even with that, it took them a few minutes to arrive to the location, and the closer they got, the worse the situation became. The pulse of Ryotsu washed over them again. From this close, they both realized it actually wasn't just one Ryotsu, but two. Moreover, whoever was leaking it felt odd. It was as if the sources had both a Shinigami and a hollow tint, with the latter a lot more prominent. Additionally, the Ryotsu was incredibly heavy. A flash of bright blue energy briefly illuminated the town, and a third source of Ryotsu appeared. However, it was much weaker than the other two and was rapidly getting even less recognizable. Before it got to the point of barely being there, a cold sweat washed over Ichigo. He recognized that Ryotsu. "We have to hurry. That's the Ishida guy, the Quincy," he muttered nervously, causing Renji to quietly curse and reach into his pocket. "Damn it, the connection with Siridi is unsteady." Third pulse of Ryotsu spread across the town, and Ichigo glanced at Renji. "You have a seal on you, right?" "Yeah." The teen looked away from him. "I hope the connection will improve, because I think you'll need all the power you have." Leaping over the last obstacle, they finally arrived to the location, only to receive an invisible punch in a form of a Ryotsu that briefly rooted them to the ground. Wide-eyed, Ichigo couldn't believe his eyes. The whole street looked like a battlefield. Broken trees, lamp posts, destroyed houses, rubble. Everywhere he looked, there was pure devastation. In the center of it stood two beings he had never seen before. One of them, a giant humanoid with tan skin, powerful build and a jawbone resting on his chin, held a person Ichigo recognized to be Urayu Ishida by his neck. The other one was smaller, built almost like a human, with black hair and half of his head covered with the remnants of a broken horned helmet, seemingly made out of a bone. "Eh? What is this? I was hoping for a good meal or at least a good fight, and this is all I get." When Urayu was thrown away, Ichigo noticed a large hole in the middle of the creature's torso. It surprised him to the point where he barely managed to move in time to catch the limp body of the Quincy. "This is bad, he's barely alive," Ichigo noted and carefully put him down, a bit away from the battlefield. "Oh, we got two newcomers. Oi, Ulquiorra, can I smash them to pieces?" The larger creature called out to the other one. "Look closer, Yami. The one with orange hair is your target." The smaller one, Ulquiorra, replied. Ichigo instantly turned away from Urayu and looked at the two beings, supposedly hollows, in surprise. "I'm their target." Yami, the large hollow, grinned from ear to ear and cracked his knuckles. "What about the other one?" Ichigo saw Ulquiorra glance in Renji's direction. The hollow briefly looked the vice captain over and then looked back at Yami. "He's just a trash. You can kill him." Blood froze in Ichigo's veins and he heard Renji growling. Hey, that's not funny at all." The vice captain quickly whispered something into the small communication device and then reached for his Zanpakuto. Ichigo hastily did the same. He had no idea what was going on, but his instinct was telling him to keep his focus at the utmost level. The Ryotsu leaking from the two in front of him was dense, and it looked like that was just its lowest point. Aura. A large fist suddenly descended upon the teen and he barely managed to jump away in time before the ground beneath him got demolished. Pieces of soil, concrete, and asphalt burst out of the fissure, denying Ichigo the view on anything. Only thanks to his instinct he was able to dodge another punch. It forced him to leap in the air, from where he saw Renji trying to slice the hollow, only for his blade to slide along Yami's body without effect. No blood came out of the point of impact, just sparks. In response, Renji received a backhanded slap that blew him away and into a nearby house. Unable to form a thought, Ichigo immediately gripped the hilt of his Zanpakuto. He had sparred with Renji before and he knew that if the man couldn't harm his opponent, then Ichigo probably wouldn't have fared better, the seal on the vice captain notwithstanding. Bleach their souls, Zanjutsu. An explosion of Ryuryoku and the large increase in Ichigo's Ryotsu instantly caught the attention of both hollows. Ulquiorra stared at him with unreadable expression, while Yami formed a shit-eating grin. That's better. Maybe he's not a trash after all. Ichigo shot at Yami like a bullet. Maneuvering around the hollows another punch, he put his weight into his larger sword and brought it down on the outstretched arm in front of him. Thud. To both Hollow's surprise, Yami's arm, cleanly cleaved below the shoulder, fell on the ground. "Yeah. You little shit." A backhanded slap from the Hollow's other hand caught Ichigo by surprise and his body was blasted away, following similar fashion as Renji's. The force behind the slap was so great, Ichigo felt like it instantly broke some of his bones, but that was just the beginning. Unable to control his body, Ichigo cried in pain when his back smashed through several thick house walls. When the momentum died down and he finally came to a stop, Ichigo felt like puking his guts out. His regeneration was already kicking in, but the pain was incredible. He had never received such a powerful hit before. In a distance, he heard Renji's voice. "Howl, Zabumaru." Gh. Groaning, Ichigo forced himself to move. Unsteady on his feet, he slowly moved back to the battlefield, while mentally trying to come up with a tactic. He has incredible strength, but I can harm him. I only need to avoid getting hit. Releasing some of his hold on his Ryuryoku, he felt the energy spread across his body, rejuvenating him and giving him some of his strength back. He tightened the grip on his Zanpakuto and flashed forward, just in time to see Renji almost buckling under the pressure of Yami's another punch. He saw a chance and leaped in the air, but before he could do anything, Yami swiftly kicked Renji in his guts and then turned around. Looking at the teen, he opened his mouth and a bright red orb of energy formed in its center. Ichigo realized what was going on too late. Zero. A beam of red energy crashed into him midair. Only by pure luck, he managed to place both his swords in front of him in time and use them as a shield. However, he was still blown back as some of the energy leaked through his swords and slightly singed the skin on his arms. "How do you like that, huh? Aura, aura, aura." While falling down, he saw several small bursts of red energy shooting from Yami's fists as he showered the whole battlefield with them. Indiscriminately, he fired them at will and explosions soon covered not just the battlefield but the surrounding environment as well. Dust and debris flew everywhere and Ichigo had trouble seeing anything. Still, he could feel the Hollow's Ryutsu signature well enough to know where the creature stood, and so he raised his larger sword high in the air. Getsuga Tensho. The dark crescent-shaped blast of energy shot from the blade and sailed through the air, clearing it on its way, until the smaller Hollow, Ulquiorra, appeared in front of Yami and swatted it away like a fly. Ichigo's eyes almost bulged out of his sockets. "Be barehanded. Ulquiorra, you bastard. What's the matter with you?" "Quiet, Yami. Because you stupidly let them cut off your arm, you would probably have some problems facing the two of them at once." The vice captain also released his limiter. "Not to mention, this one seems interesting." Ichigo felt his throat drying up. "The Getsuga I just fired at Yami wasn't one of my strongest, but it was still considerably powerful. It should have done at least some damage, but stopping it barehanded? And without any injury? What is this guy?" As Yami's fight with Renji continued, Ichigo felt Ulquiorra's stare. "Come, Shinigami. Show me what you can do." Ichigo tightened his grip on his Zanpakuto. It had been a very long time since he last felt it, but now, staring at the emotionless eyes of the Hollow in front of him, that emotion slowly spread into his whole body like a poison once again. Fear. He wasn't sure how, but he just knew it. His whole soul was screaming at him that Ulquiorra, the creature in front of him, was bad news. That it was an opponent he couldn't defeat. It was disheartening and terrifying. He hadn't felt such a thing even when he faced the Bounce, Kenpei, Yoryuki, or the Kazumioji assassins. Only the Captain Commander had been able to instill such an emotion in him. "What's wrong, Shinigami? You faced Yami without a shred of hesitation, so why hesitate now? I'm not even armed, yet." His eyes fell upon the sword tied to Ulquiorra's side. If the Hollow was so strong without it. Enough. So what if he's strong? You just have to get stronger. A strained voice called out to him. In that moment, Ichigo missed it, but it sounded as if his Zanpakuto spirit was trying not to speak yet was forced to. More Ryuryoku spread across the teen's body and a small fragment of a hollow mask formed above his right eye, causing the Hollow in front of him to blink. "I see. Aizen-sama truly is never wrong." Ulquiorra's words were overwhelming. They masked even the sound of the fight happening behind him and caused Ichigo to twitch. Instantly, he raised his Zanpakuto and brought it down. Getsuga Tensho. A large black mass of spiritual energy shot out of his Zanpakuto, scorching the ground beneath it as it traveled towards Ulquiorra. Who wasn't there? Ichigo. A hit to his abdomen forced him to vomit everything that had been in his stomach as a sense of hopelessness overwhelmed the teen. There was nothing stopping his Getsuga anymore, and it passed the other hollow and continued through the houses until it exploded in a shower of black rain. That is an interesting ability. It gives the feeling of Zero Oscuras, even though it's considerably less powerful. On his knees and barely able to breathe, Ichigo saw Ulquiorra retracting his hand and muttering something as the hollow stood next to him with an indifferent expression. He saw Ulquiorra's leg moving towards him but was unable to defend himself. Gah! His body rolled across the battlefield like a rag doll with limbs flailing around. Passing by the other fight, a large foot connected with his side and changed the direction his body was helplessly moving in. Oi, Ulquiorra, I thought you said this one wasn't trash. Only by sheer force of will Ichigo managed to raise his right arm and blocked a weak kick, but it was followed with another, more powerful one that he couldn't block anymore. I was wrong. From the corner of his eyes, Ichigo Sorenji sprawled on the remnants of a concrete wall. He was bloodied and seemed to be completely out of it. The teen couldn't even tell if he was still alive. So, can I kill him? Yet another kick sent him flying across the whole battlefield and away from it, towards the place where his Getsuga previously exploded. When he landed, he smelled something vile coming from not that far away. A small hand touched his shoulder. I'm sorry for being late, Kurosaka-san. On the brink of consciousness, he recognized the voice. Urahara. Kisuke. Don't worry, we got you. A second, feminine voice said to him as the owner moved toward the battlefield. Ichigo rolled over, on his stomach, and it was then, when he saw something he wished he never saw. There, in a short distance, where his Getsuga seemingly exploded, lay several bodies covered in blood. Most of them were wearing clothes that tied them to the academy. Just before his consciousness left him, he realized there was another body lying there. A person that had a bright pink hair and was wearing a symbol of the 4th Division. When he finally passed out, it was with tears flowing out of his eyes. Chapter 27, Eclipse of the Black Sun, Unleashed Leash. The captain commander of the Godi I-13 watched as his captains slowly assembled for the captain's meeting. His eyes were mostly closed, but despite that, one could feel the raw emotion radiating from him like a molten lava. Seldom as it was, when the commander wasn't in his good mood, his enemies shook at their very core. Still, upset as he was, Yamamoto waited patiently. All those years he had lived so far taught him that hurrying was never good. When the captains finally assembled, he tapped the floor with his cane and took a good look around. This captain's meeting is now in effect. So what's the hurry, old man? Sun's barely out. Completely ignoring Yamamoto's upset Ryotsugu, Kenpeki asked with a yawn. While the commander tolerated the rude captain's behavior most of the time, he wasn't in the mood for it now. A burst of Ryotsugu caused Kenpeki to immediately stop yawning and look at him in surprise. While this isn't a complete emergency, yesterday's evening brought us some very disturbing news. Yamamoto stated and glanced in Mayuri's direction. Captain Kurotsuke, if you please. The captain of the 12th Division gave him a nod and stepped up. Thank you, Commander. Indeed, yesterday truly was full of news. I'll try to speak slowly, as the commander wants all of you to understand. He spoke and looked at each captain with a grimace. Yesterday evening in the human world, a small Garganta portal formed in the sky above Karakura town. We, at the Shinigami Research and Development Institute, recorded 2 Ryotsugu signatures coming out of it. The Ryotsugu composition was similar in both cases and, after analyzing them, we came to a conclusion that these 2 signatures belonged to a certain type of hollows. This type of hollow is unique in a fact that its spiritual energy has a certain Shinigami trait in it. I'm sure you realized it, but, yes, I'm speaking of a hollow which has removed its mask, an Arrancar. He paused for his words to sink in. Now, as per the new directive, we regularly send Shinigami from different divisions to the human world and, thanks to that, we have eyewitnesses to these Arrancars. The vice-captain of the 6th Division, Aburai Renji, and the 3rd seat of the 9th Division, Kurosaki Ichigo, both came across these Aaron cars. However, they were forced to fight them and suffered an utter and complete defeat. They survived only thanks to a timely intervention by Urahara Kisuk and Shihoin Yoriyuki. Both officers are now in the 4th Division, recuperating from minor to serious injuries, but I managed to get their statements. The Aaron cars' names were Yemi and Ulquiorra, and they both possessed not just humanoid appearances but also human-like intelligence. He paused again. I guess it shouldn't come as a surprise, but they also mentioned the name Aizen Sosuke. Several growls resonated in the meeting room. It seems the man had sent them to the human world to test Kurosaki Ichigo. The eyes of the captains glanced in Ishine's direction. The captain of the 10th Division tried not to react, but it was clear he, same as the commander, wasn't in one of his best moods. Based on the data we got, it seems the Aaron car Yemi is one of the weaker Aaron cars, while the other one, Ulquiorra, belongs to the stronger. At the same time, though, they both exceed the normal power of hollows. What is the estimation on their fighting capability? Toshiro asked. Mayuri briefly mulled over the answer with a thoughtful expression. Hard to say. As per the two officers' words, at the beginning, they only fought Yemi. Unreleased, they were unable to harm the creature's Iero that the vice-captain of the 6th Division described as tougher than steel. From the sidelines, Kenpakis coughed. Like that's hard to cut. Ignoring that remark, Mayuri continued. Even in Shikai state, Aburai admitted he still had troubles making any deeper wounds. However, Kurosaki, also in Shikai state, was able to cut off the creature's arm. That gives us a rough estimation of Yemi's Iero density. It can withstand the force below a vice-captain level combatant, but a captain should not have troubles getting past it. The Aaron car's strength is, however, at least on par with a captain, if not even a bit above. So, he's similar to Zaraki. Oi, Shorty. Mayuri looked at the irritated captain of the 11th Division with an odd expression. I can't believe I'm about to say it, but no, he's a bit different. The Aaron car Yemi seems to possess even less intelligence than Zaraki. He stated and, ignoring Zaraki's grimace, turned back to Toshiro. Ryotsu-wise, Yemi seems to be above a vice-captain level combatant but below a captain. All in all, he is at least on the lower spectrum of a captain level combatant. Therefore, I suspect he's an Ajicha's turned Aaron car. When he said that, a short silence washed over the meeting. And he's one of the weaker Aaron cars. Toshiro never broke the eye contact with the scientist. What about the other one? Mayuri paused and then glanced at other captains, mainly at Amagai and Ishine. Captain Amagai and Captain Shiba, you two witnessed Kurosaki Ichigo using an ability called Getchuga in the Valley of Screams. How powerful would you say it is? Amagai and Ishine briefly looked at each other. Depends on how much of Ryuryoka he puts in it, but, in general, I'd say it could incapacitate a vice-captain and injure a captain a lot. If you tried to take it head-on, of course. Ishine replied and Amagai only nodded in agreement. Mayuri turned back to Toshiro. The other Aaron car swatted it with his bare hand and without sustaining any damage whatsoever. I see. Toshiro muttered with a grimace. Also, his speed was so great, Kurosaki claimed he never saw him move. He just vanished from his sight, only to appear right next to him. Ryotsu-wise, he's also leagues above the other one. I'd estimate his fighting capabilities above that of a captain. The silence that fell upon the room lasted for a lot longer than the previous did. Vastolord. As always, the one who broke it was Shunsui. But it was not with a sly grin. His expression was a lot more somber than that. Pained even. Mayuri turned to him. Yes, I believe so. It would be hard to imagine an Ajicha's becoming this strong, even after turning Aaron car. If he has more Aaron cars like that. Yukate quietly muttered, bringing forth the question most of them thought about. Or maybe we are simply overestimating Kurosaki Ichigo. All of these conclusions are based upon his level of power. Are we really sure he is as strong as a captain? Everyone looked at the large captain in the middle of the left row, Komamura. He was the one who, so far, hadn't come into any contact with Ichigo. It was the captain commander who answered him. No. He is not as skilled as a captain. That is one of the reasons he was given the third seat. However, his pure power is undeniable. His achievements, statements from all the officers who spar with him and also Aizen Sosuke's interest in him all speak for themselves. Ichigo. When Rukia finally withdrew her hands and stood up to leave, the teen looked away. He didn't want to see her worried gaze or eyes filled with pity. It was the last thing he needed. She gave him a few last words and then closed the door behind her, leaving him alone at last. Even if he tried, Ichigo couldn't come up with a single thing to think about. There was nothing within his mind. His consciousness was filled with the void, it was devoid of any emotions. He just lay there, sprawled across the bed, staring at the ceiling with an empty look in his eyes, feeling absolutely nothing. He felt completely empty. The melancholy he had felt many times returned with a vengeance and it didn't look like it would go away anytime soon. Regret. Guilty conscience. Self-loathing. Those were the emotions he thought he would feel once he had regained consciousness. He still hoped they would come. Anything was better than the void currently residing within him. The feeling of not being able to feel was eating him from inside. Like a cell-dissolving poison, it slowly spread into his whole body, until only an unidentified mass, a blank goo of meat, remained. It was numbing. Strength-sapping. Excruciating. He wanted to fight it. To remind himself of himself. To stay as he was, the person he had been molded into. But it was pointless. A Sayamaki. It had been him who had killed all those innocent students. That was the undeniable, inescapable, and hard truth he had to face, truth he had to accept. But, how do you live with that much innocent blood on your hands? Ichigo didn't know. He had killed before. He had killed dozens and more. Even innocents had fallen under his sword. However, that happened only once and it had been out of his control. Or had it been? Maybe I'm just trying to run away from something I can't outrun. That at my core, I'm just another murderer. Before he knew it, he raised his right arm and touched his face with it. That part, where the fragment of his mask always formed first. An unnatural chuckle came out of his mouth. Along with it, a tear flowed down his face. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Vigorously crashing open the doors to the office of the captain of the 1th Division, Ichigo stopped moving only once he was in front of the man himself. Kenpeki. Spar with me. The large captain, until now staring at the ceiling in boredom, instantly formed a large grin. He completely ignored the damaged doors, hanging on the hinges, and reached for his sword. You have no idea how fucking happy you just made me, Ichigo. Let's go. At the sound of his booming voice, a small person clad in Shinigami clothes crashed through the office window and landed right on Kenpeka's back. Yahoo! Go get him, Ken-chan. That person was a little girl with a happy face, pink hair, and a smile that could melt hearts. Ichigo did not recall ever seeing her before but, despite that, he didn't ask who she was. He didn't really want to know. Despite that, he found out her identity almost immediately, as his gaze was drawn to the lieutenant badge on her right arm. Don't mind Yachiro. Kenpeka stated. The two of them quickly moved to the training grounds reserved for the 11th Division and stood facing each other a moment after that. With his Zanpakuto already raised above his head, Ichigo called out to the captain. Until one of us can't continue. Kenpeka's grin grew even wider. Wouldn't have it any other damn way. Ishine was quietly filling in his paperwork when a small tremor caused his desk to shake and his glass toppled over, spilling water everywhere. In surprise, he jerked away and wiggled his nose in annoyance. Damn it! He quickly reached for some paper towels but the damage has been done and the paper he had been just writing on was now unusable. The captain tried to salvage as much as he could but he soon realized it was pointless. Whether he wanted or didn't, he would have to start over. His eyebrow twitching, he threw the used paper towels into trash and then leaned on his chair to look out the window. What's the big idea, though? However, from his window, he couldn't see a thing and so, for a moment, he hesitated. But his curiosity won and made him go outside, to try and find out more. Once he left the barracks, though, his senses were assaulted by a heavy riot suppressing on his shoulder, coming from not that far away. Ichigo and Zaraki. He muttered, a bit worried. Having those two together at one place always meant trouble. He glanced back at the entrance to the barracks and paused. He really needed to finish doing his share of paperwork. He'll be fine, he thought, only for a powerful pulse of Ryotsu to wash over Siriti. His body almost automatically turned back toward the source of the energy. Or maybe not. What the hell are you doing, son? Leaving his paperwork as it was, Ishine hastily left the 10th Division compound and hurried to the 11th Division's training ground. There was no other place Kenpeki and Ichigo could have been. A few short minutes later, he reached the entrance to the 11th Division compound and watched as a group of healers from the 4th Division strode towards his own destination. That wasn't a very calming sight, and so the speed of his steps increased. Once he got around the barracks and reached the outskirts of the training grounds, he heard a mixture of voices. TCH, who's the pussy that called these guys? But Captain, you're bleeding all over. Ah, got the pussy. And, for your information, this is just a scratch. Kurosaka-san, please don't move. We really need to close that wound. Get the fuck away from me. Ishine froze. The last line belonged to his son, he was sure of it. He could recognize his voice anywhere and anytime. But there was something in that voice he didn't remember ever hearing. He couldn't really put his finger on it, but it just didn't sound like the usual Ichigo. It was cold. Cold and terrifying. When he finally entered the training ground, he saw one of the 4th Division medics cowering before a positively frightening teen. Covered in blood from the multiple cuts and gashes on his body, Ichigo's eyes stared at the medic like a predator looking at his next prey. His injuries, albeit not life-threatening, were vast in number and awful in appearance. He was visibly wobbling, but, despite that, he was stubbornly refusing any assistance. He raised his head and his eyes met Ishine's. Ishine gulped. There was barely any emotion in his son's eyes. What he was able to see was just anger. Pure, raw loathing. Even when he clearly realized whom he was looking at, Ichigo's gaze didn't change. His facial muscles just lightly twitched, and that was all. I don't need any help. I'm fine. Ishine heard him say, and then glance in Kenpeka's direction. I'll come again soon. Kenpeka just raised one of his hands, while his lieutenant, the pink-haired kid, energetically waved. We'll be looking forward to that, Ichi. Bye-bye. The captain of the 10th Division took a step towards his son, but, in a pulse of Ryotsu, Ichigo vanished from his sight and, with it, left the man with a clear message. Leave me alone. Ishine felt a bit of a worry creeping into his soul. An hour later, Ichigo limped out of the shower and fell face first on his bed. A quiet hiss escaped his mouth as the impact caused his recently closed gashes to open and a bit of blood seeped through the awkwardly placed bandages and on his blanket. He remained in the same position for several long minutes until he was sure the wounds weren't bleeding anymore. Then he carefully rolled over so he could stare at the ceiling, a position that quickly became one of his favorite. So weak. He whispered with a pained grimace and placed his left forearm on top of his brow. I couldn't even get him to lose that damn eye patch. His right hand twisted into a fist and he raised it above his head, to look at it. So damn weak. Following day, evening. Staring at the empty office of the 11th Division captain in disappointment, Ichigo heard a familiar voice calling out to him. Captain is not here, Ichigo. Yeah, I noticed. TCH. The teen growled and turned to leave, only to feel a hand on his left shoulder. But if it's a spar you're looking for, then I'm all in. We haven't done it for some time. Looking over his shoulder, Ichigo gave the bald man, Ikeku, a short glance. The third seat of the 11th Division was a good sparring partner. He was far weaker than his captain, but the movements of his Zanpakuto were always hard to read. Sure. The teen retorted and quickly followed the other man to the training grounds. Once there, he took a deep breath and began ignoring the crowd that gathered on their way there. It seemed it was impossible to have a spar in the 11th Division compound without attracting at least some attention. He concentrated and focused all of his awareness on the battle to come. Go! Faster than the speed of any Kido spell, Ichigo leaped forward and brought his Zanpakuto down in full force. It was at this moment Ikeku realized Ichigo wasn't in the mood to play cat and mouse. Using both his sword and its sheath to block the strike, One of Ikeku's knees crashed into the ground as the power behind the attack exceeded his expectations. Good stuff. Despite almost being overpowered, Ikeku's smile didn't wilt. Similar to his captain, he welcomed the challenge. Spinning on that one knee, his other leg shot out and forced Ichigo to jump away. But that bought Ikeku barely a second of a breathing window. That was how long Ichigo needed to jump back into the fray. The blade of his Zanpakuto was pushed to the side and hit the ground with enough force to cave it in. In the wake of the strike, a small cloud of dusty particles swirled upwards. His sword followed the motion and revealed the fissure lying beneath it. After that, the two combatants entered a continuous, furious, and deadly dance of metal and sweat. Each strike resonated through the training area like the sound of gongs. Each missed attack caused a breeze of wind to cool their muscles but not their zeal. Every mistake was promptly punished and the scene from the previous day soon became the current déjà vu. Both covered with several cuts, blood began to fill the air around them as if they tried to create a shower of red. Ikeku eventually started to show first signs of fatigue. When it happened, he tried to continue for a bit longer but then admitted defeat. But Ichigo never let go of his fervor. In his verve, he missed the sign of the battle's end and continued to pour his onslaught, forcing Ikeku to leap away. As soon as he did so, the ground where he just stood gave in to the pressure of Ichigo's last strike and exploded from the redundancy of energy. Whoa, time out Ichigo. Ikeku wheezed out, unsteady on his feet. Ichigo stopped moving. The sudden exclamation seemed to at least bring him back to his senses. Still, with his head lowered, back hunched, and body covered in blood, he didn't look like someone who wanted to stop fighting. But then, he slowly straightened his back and gave Ikeku a short glance, similar to the one he had given him before the fight. Thanks for the spar. Tell Kenpeki to be ready next time I come. Midnight. Winter was coming and the night air within Siriti was gradually getting colder. It was chilly enough for Ichigo to see his own breath as he stood in front of a small memorial gravestone, his hands forming fists and his face twisted into a pained grimace. There were no names on the gravestone but Ichigo didn't care. The names of the deceased were not important. The face that was the one responsible for their deaths, on the other hand, was. All those students, innocent kids with future, gone. Their lives lost because of his mistake. A mistake he would have to live with for the rest of his life. The image of their torn bodies, their bloodied, lifeless corpses appeared with the teen's mind. It brought a pain to his heart. A formidable emotion that wouldn't go away no matter how hard he tried. Am I even allowed to forget? Among those dead bodies, there had been a person with bright pink hair and it was the one death that hit Ichigo the hardest. Yuno Kiraku had had a crappy life. It had been worse than Ichigo's by a large margin. However, for the past few months, it had been making a turn for the better. She had even gotten herself into the trainee program in the 4th division. She was gone now. Death had taken her away. Death with the name of Ichigo Kurosaki. The 3rd seed of the 9th division and a murderer. Ichigo's knees got weak and he fell on the gravestone. He clutched it with his hands, as if trying to rip it apart, to undo the past. A weak voice escaped his lips. I'm sorry. No matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, death seemed to follow him every time. His mother. His sisters. Kazumi. Yuno. Gears of fate were turning against Ichigo. That much he was aware of. He wanted to fight it, to break the cycle but, at the moment, he simply didn't have the necessary strength. It was like he was being tested. Like his sanity and soul were being questioned in an attempt at crushing his very essence. Ichigo-kun. As soon as he heard the voice, Ichigo felt his innards freezing. Ice filled him from within, making him unable to move any part of his body. His mind briefly stopped working. It was unable to process the situation. He recognized the voice. Ever since he had woken up after his battle in the human world, he had been deathly afraid of facing its owner. What could he say to the man? How could he look him in the eyes? Ichigo didn't know and it scared him more than anything. Because of him, the captain of the 8th division had lost his niece. The hard truth made him feel wobbly every time he recalled the dead bodies, all those victims of his mistake. Now, the man stood behind him and Ichigo felt like struck by a lightning. His skin charred, his muscles torn and his skeleton grinded into dust. He was unable to even twitch. "I didn't know you were here." A pulse of life desperately ran across his body in a poor attempt to jumpstart his limbs and brain. He felt the man slowly approaching him. Panic overcame him and cold sweat formed all over his body. He was unable to breathe. His lungs were burning with the desire for oxygen and his mind was screaming in pain. Hyperventilating, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Are you alright, Ichigo-kun? This isn't right." Desperately trying to control his own body and mind, Ichigo remained as silent as the night sky above him. He wanted to turn around and tell the man just how sorry he was so badly. With his sanity on the line, he fought his own soul and managed to slightly open his mouth. He weakly whispered. "Ichigo-kun." Ichigo trembled, the pain within him growing larger. The worry in the man's voice was more than just palpable and Ichigo hated him for that. He hated how sincere and honest he sounded. Ichigo wanted him to yell at him, to scream at him, to cut him into pieces, but the captain was doing the exact opposite. Ichigo couldn't take it anymore. An avalanche of Ryoryoka washed over him and he sharply stood up. Then, just as the man behind him tried to say something, he leaped into the air and vanished in a burst of shunpo. Several days later, slowly picking himself up from the ground, Ichigo warily eyed the captain of the 4th Division as she tended to Kenpaku's injuries. Both covered in blood, Ichigo and Kenpaku were once again in the 11th Division training grounds, exhausted after a brutal spar. While Anohana knelt next to Kenpaku, some medics cautiously approached Ichigo, only to receive a hard glare that easily scared them off. As he unsteadily got to his feet, Ichigo felt something akin to a dark aura coming off from Anohana that caused him to narrow his eyes. It was the first time the captain of the 4th Division accompanied her subordinates once they had been called to the training grounds, and it caught Ichigo by surprise. He didn't think Kenpaku's wound were that serious, so there wasn't really any point in her coming along. A grimace settled on Ichigo's face when he thought about all those spars with Kenpaku. "I can't seem to get an upper hand over this guy. The more we spar, the stronger he seems to be," he thought and glanced at his bloodied hands. "Or maybe I'm getting weaker." The possibility of that being true shook the teen to the very core. Ignoring the pain, he closed the palms of his hands and squeezed them until blood began to seep through the cuts on his forearms. "Kurosaka-san." An angelic voice called out to him and he turned to its owner. Anohana was looking at him over her shoulder with a sweet smile but also with a terrifying aura. "I will have to ask you to stop sparring with Captain Zaraki." Ichigo's eyebrows twitched. The ire within him rose and momentarily made him blind to the captain's grimness. "What?" Anohana kept her smile but her emotions leaked in form of Ryotsu. "This is the 4th time we had to come over and heal Captain Zaraki during this week. I understand the need for a spar, but this is unacceptable. These wounds, while not life-threatening for a captain, could cripple an ordinary officer for an indefinite period of time. A captain can heal from them faster, but it still makes him weaker and vulnerable for at least a day or two, which is undesirable in the current situation. Moreover, personally, I do not approve of spars that result in these kind of injuries. Like I care what you approve of." It was just a whisper, but, because of the silence in the area, Ichigo's words were loud enough for everyone to hear. Almost everyone froze in surprise. Even Kenpaku, lying on the ground, appeared to be caught off guard. The medics were positively horrified. They all stared at Ichigo as if he suddenly grew a second head. In response to the teen's whisper, Anohana's smile stiffened and became spasmodic. Still, the captain of the 4th Division managed to keep calm. "Be that as it may, the next time you try to spar with Captain Zaraki, you'll have to deal with me, Kurosaka-san." Even though he felt cold sweat forming on the palms of his hands, Ichigo kept his composure and faced Anohana's stern gaze and grim Ryotsu with an irritated glare. "Really? Why don't we skip all of that and do it right now, Captain?" Nobody dared to speak a single word. Even the wind seemed to stop flowing. The air slowly became incredibly heavy. Filled with dense Ryotsu and sense of dread, it pressed on everyone with great intensity. Anohana's smile finally wilted. She stood up and slowly walked towards the teen, stopping only when she was barely an inch away from him. Tilting her head, she leaned forward and aimed her breath at his ear. Do not tempt me, boy. I'll say it again. Leave Captain Zaraki alone. You do not want to face the consequences. The moment Anohana began to speak, all of Ichigo's senses went haywire. It was like death himself whispered into his ear, singing the final lullaby of Limbo. His heart began pumping so fast, it felt like it would burst out of his chest. A strange chilling noise echoed within his mind, odd enough to freeze his very thoughts. He felt fear. And he hated himself for that. Forbidden from fighting Kenpeka for an undefined amount of time, Ichigo spent the next few days wandering through the Serai with a burning desire for a good spar. However, finding something like that seemed to be an unreachable goal. There were officers who would gladly agree to a match but, in Ichigo's eyes, they were too weak. Too weak to give him a challenge he couldn't overcome in a matter of seconds. Ichigo didn't doubt their strength but he was aware of their limit and those limits were lower than his. What he was looking for was a fight in which he would get squashed, crushed, and pummeled into the ground. He needed it to remind himself of his defeat and of his mistake. To once again relieve those feelings of hopelessness and fear so he could smash them with his resolve. And those who could do that for him were rare in number. For that reason, he somehow ended up facing Renji barely a day after receiving the ban on Kenpeki. Hell, Zabumaru. Ichigo faced him with an odd feeling in his stomach. Renji had been there with him, on that day they both had been defeated. Yet Renji shook that shame in a matter of days. He clearly wanted to get stronger and was working hard for it but his eyes were clear. Without releasing his own Zanpakuto, Ichigo met the vice captain in the center of the training grounds and traded several blows with him. The spar lasted for quite a while but, in the end, it was Ichigo who ended it prematurely. Okay, I think that's enough. He said with a raised hand. Neither of them was covered in much blood, the spar had been a lot less brutal than the ones Ichigo had had with Kenpeki. So, I've been thinking of pushing myself into acquiring my Bankai. Renji suddenly said, interrupting Ichigo's thoughts while doing so. After the spar ended, the vice captain asked Ichigo to stay for a beer. The teen wanted to leave but, as they both shared the bond of defeat, he decided a beer wouldn't hurt. In the end, though, Renji was the only one who spoke through the moment. Ichigo just listened to him with an empty stare. I can already materialize Zabumaru so I'm thinking it's just a few years away. Bankai, huh? Ichigo thought numbly. Then he shook his head. What am I thinking about? I can barely control my Shikai and I have just one ability. Before I can even think of Bankai I have to get used to the full power of my initial release. Soon after that thought ran across his mind, he excused himself and left Renji with his own thoughts. Hisagi, Ikeku, Rukia, Amagai, all of them eventually agreed on a spar but not one of them had been satisfactory. Not of them had given Ichigo the desired sense of being overpowered. He had hoped the captain of the 3rd division would be the one but he had been wrong. The man was strong but he had refused to use that much power on the teen, calling it unprofessional and suicidal. Ichigo found it quite funny, especially that last part. In the end, though, he couldn't get any other captain to fight with him. As the last resort, he tried a few lower-ranking officers but, every time, it ended up just like he thought it would. In a disappointment. But then, one worried Shinigami officer found him and gave him that thing he craved for so much. The one person he had forgotten to ask for a spar. The person that had been the only thing left from his past life. His father. Ishine. Serai, in front of the 10th Division compound. 2 days had passed since Ichigo managed to convince anybody to spar with him and it was starting to annoy the hell out of him. He needed to vent his emotions, all those thorn vines wrapped around his soul, because he was afraid he was going to explode like a nuclear bomb. However, the word about his spars had spread across the Serai like a wildfire and there was barely anyone left who was willing to fight him. Hey, son. How is it going? Ichigo grimaced. Currently, he was not in the mood for his father or any polite, friendly conversations. He needed to train. He needed to fight. Changing the direction of his steps, he tried to ignore the man only to hear him calling out to him. Ichigo, wait. A rough hand fell on his right shoulder and prevented him from walking away. Yeah. After a short pause, he heard Ishine sighing. I heard, well, you probably don't want to talk about anything but... I'm here, son. If you want to spar, I can spar with you. Ichigo stiffened. The sudden offer completely surprised him and caused a simple thought to appear in his mind. Of course. Dad's a captain too. Why didn't I think of him? Getting over his surprise, Ichigo slowly turned his head and looked at his Hine over his shoulder. A tiny twinge of regret echoed in his heart when he saw the worried expression on the man's face. Soon after that, though, it was replaced by a similarly strong emotion. An ire. He was sure his Hine was pitying him and he didn't that. Fine, but under one condition. He said quietly, to which his Hine raised both his eyebrows. Which is? I want you to fight seriously and to come at me with everything you have. He saw some emotion flash within his Hine's eyes. I can't do that, Ichigo. One should never use a Bankai for any kind of spar. An eerie chuckle crawled from Ichigo's mouth. Heh, I wasn't talking about Bankai. There is still some common sense in my head left. They moved to the sturdier training ground of the 10th Division. On the way there, his Hine alerted his subordinates of an oncoming spar and asked them not to interfere with it. Going even further, Ichigo asked them not to come at all. Begrudgingly, the officers agreed to spread the information around the whole division. A moment later, they faced each other at the very center of the training grounds. Both had determined expressions, as both were determined to use the spar for achieving something. No words were spoken. Then they moved. Clang. The moment their blades clashed, a breeze rose from the ground and swirled around them like a harbinger of chaos. After a brief battle over dominance, each trying to overpower the other, Ichigo found himself being pushed back. Gritting his teeth from sheer frustration, he leaped backwards, only to ricochet back once his feet licked the ground. Intent on bringing forth more power out of himself, he brought his sword down with all of his might. When it connected with his Hine's Zanpakuto, a barely audible growl came through his pressed lips. Under the heavy pressure from his strike, the man bended in knees. Despite that, Ichigo's ire rose, as his father managed to withstand the blow without any other problems. It didn't even break his stance. Resolutely, Ichigo arched one of his legs backwards and shot it right at his Hine's head. The kick missed only because the man was able to tilt his head in time. Then he seemingly vanished out of existence. Ichigo immediately spun around, ready to intercept an attack from behind, only to receive a spinning kick coming from his left side. The instep of his Hine's foot crashed into the teen's left upper arm with so much force, the nerves in that area stopped working and, instead of pain, Ichigo only felt pressure. He was instantly blown away. His body didn't crash through the borders of the training area only thanks to the Sekizeki-imbued walls that absorbed most of the energy. Still, the impact was powerful enough to knock the wind out of his lungs and leave him heaving and wheezing. If you can't handle this much, I'll have to hold myself back. A surge of anger ran through Ichigo's mind and body, allowing him to ignore the pain and quickly get back on his feet with a loud yell. Don't you dare! Willing his left arm to move, he pointed it at the man and wordlessly poured a bit of Ryu-ryoku in it. Without any warning, his Hine's arms were forcibly moved and locked behind his back. As a result, his Zanpakuto was knocked from his hand. Not even a second later, Ichigo was above him, prepared to slice him across the torso. Powerful Ryutsu filled the area as his Hine broke the Kido and threw himself on the ground, rolling away from Ichigo's strike, as well as picking up his sword. Ichigo yanked his Zanpakuto from the caved-in soil and sliced through the air he expected his Hine to appear in. A sound of sword clashing against each other reverberated across the area. That's better. His Hine exclaimed, and Ichigo watched in unpleasant surprise as the man pushed him away once again. I can't overpower him. The realization hit him in the guts and shook his confidence. Ichigo was going at it with all of his might, yet he was barely able to budge his father. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't place his finger on it. His anger, slowly boiling underneath his skin, made rational thinking impossible. With gritted teeth and closed eyes, he shifted his weight to the other leg and pushed himself to the limit. Because he wasn't looking at him, Ichigo completely missed the amazement in his Hine's face before an incredible amount of Ryutsu surged out of him and he blew the man backwards. Only when the force pressing against his sword vanished Ichigo finally looked up to see Ishine briefly sailing through the air and his own Riryoku embracing him. An almost hysterical smile formed on his face. I see. So I can't do it on my own, huh? He muttered to himself. A split second later, when he saw Ishine kicking the dirt and rushing back at him, he placed his Zanpakuto in front of himself and let his Riryoku outwardly explode. Bleach their souls, Zanjutsu. For a short moment he saw nothing but the swirling torrent of energy, surging out of him like a geyser. The dark and potent Riryoku that felt so alien, yet so familiar, washed over his whole body, rejuvenating his mind with its cold warmth and calming blackness. It felt so good. Now, let's spar for real. He stated confidently and shot through the darkness like a ray of hope until his blades made contact with Ishine's sword. Guh! Surrounded in energy, Ichigo's blow immediately forced Ishine on his knees and caved the ground beneath him. Vaulting over the man, he sliced at his back. The larger sword was blocked but the sneaky attempt with his smaller one was not. Its tip easily sliced the clothes and the skin on Ishine's back and caused a bit of blood to trickle down his left shoulder. The sight of blood on his blade caused Ichigo's hands to vibrate with satisfaction. A pleasant shudder ran through his spine and goosebumps appeared on both his arms. It just felt so damn good. A sharp backward slice forced him to leap away. He saw Ishine giving him an odd look but, in that moment, he didn't give a damn about the emotions he might have or might not have seen in the man's eyes. All he wanted was a good spar. I honestly didn't expect this much increase in power from just your initial release. I guess I'll have to completely stop holding back. The smile on Ichigo's face froze and withered away. I asked you to do that from the beginning. He growled. In return, Ishine shrugged. Bad habit. The left corner of Ichigo's upper lip, along with the whole left side of his face, twitched. He tightened the grip on his swords and let even more Riryoku to pour out of him. Unknown to him, a small bony fragment formed above his right eyebrow. You think this is a game? He whispered and blurred out of existence. Flashing all over the training area, his eyes could barely make out the silhouettes of the objects around him but he didn't care. Even if his eyes weren't yet adjusted to this much speed, his body was. He could easily crash through anything and continue moving at the same speed with almost no delay. Making fun of me, huh? He struck from behind. However, even though he targeted a different body part with each sword, his attempt was parried with Ishine's carefully placed Zanpakuto. The man spun around and Ichigo immediately received a foot in his guts. Making fun of me? Why couldn't he do it? Why was he so much weaker than the rest? His back painfully collided with the area's walls and his body slid down. But he didn't give up. Pumping more and more energy into his limbs, he stood up once again. The bony fragment on his face grew bigger. Ah! With a yell, he jumped in the air and began to spin around. With both his sword pointed away from him, he looked like a blade tornado, a Zanpakuto chainsaw ready to hack and slash. Cutting and slicing the air around him, he descended upon Ishine into a god of wrath and forced him to retreat. Eventually though, he had to stop spinning and it was in that moment Ishine struck back. His sword, cloaked in a bit of bright energy, missed Ichigo only by an accident but the teen was still blasted sideways. Why? 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 He managed to remain on his feet but had to guard himself barely a second later. Despite having two blades instead of one, he was still being pushed back. Why, god damn it. Getsuga Tensho. With only few inches between them, Ichigo's Getsuga had nowhere to go and the accumulated energy blew up in a spectacular, dark explosion that scorched both combatants. Right after that, Ishine jumped back to create a bit of distance between them. His face, a bit red in a few places, showed distress. That was too much, Ichigo. I think it's time to end th. No. Instantly closing the gap, Ichigo brought his Zanpakuto down in a way that didn't leave any time or space for protesting. Left with no choice, Ishine parried the strike and increased the pressure of his Ryutsu in an attempt to slow the teen down. But Ichigo didn't even budge. It seemed as if the weight of Ishine's Ryutsu had no effect on him anymore. Relentlessly, he cut and cleaved, never stopping in his onslaught and never giving his father even a tiny chance to breathe. This can't end yet. I'm still too weak. Changing his tactic, Ichigo vaulted over the man and hurriedly cast another binding Kido. Overstuffed with energy, the spell's backlash inured his hand, but it still managed to create the desired effect. He drew blood for the second time during the spar. Calm down, Ichigo. Still not enough. Somewhere, coming from the back of his mind, he heard somebody yelling at him. But he ignored it. His mind was already loud enough from all of his echoing thoughts, filling his consciousness with an incredible thirst. It fueled him. It powered him. It made his senses sharp. The fragment on his face grew enough to completely cover his right eye and cheekbone. Ichigo. Ah. Like in slow motion, Ichigo watched his father sail through the air once again. The sight didn't scare him. It didn't cause him to feel any kind of worry, regret or guilt. Instead, it satisfied him. To see his foe retreat was the best dessert. To send his opponent flying away was dish served cold. It was the best feeling in the world. More. A crescent wave of dark energy shot out of his Zanpakuto, fulfilling his desire even more. I can feel the power. I will no longer be weak. The fragment grew even more. Ichigo. Stop. With his eyes wide open, Ichigo could feel the wide smile on his face. He could feel the fire writhing beneath his skin, squirming within his veins. Everything he had accomplished so far was nothing in comparison with this feeling of satisfaction. It was incredible. It was overwhelming. It made him ecstatic. The anger, the guilt, the shame, and loath, all and every emotion he had bottled for so long, all those feelings boiling within his soul were now crawling from the depths of his heart in an attempt to be set free. He couldn't fight back. To do that was to fight his own self. It would be painful. And he didn't want to hurt anymore. A surge of energy unlike anything he had felt before entered his being and his vision exploded. Ishaine's POV. Ichigo, no. Frozen in horror, Ishaine was unable to look away from scene taking place right in front of his very eyes. What had been his son, his only son, was now enveloped in an energy so dark, so heavy, and so terrifying, it made his skin crawl. What had been Ichigo just a moment ago, was now something he no longer knew. The sheer amount of Ryuryoku pouring out of him or the texture of his Ryutsu didn't resemble the teen in the slightest. The only thing Ishaine could feel was an overwhelming rage and an instinct screaming for blood. He had a vague idea of what was going on but was trying to reject it. It wouldn't happen. It couldn't. Ichigo was not somebody who would let. The energy dissipated and revealed Ishaine's worst nightmare, scary enough to make him pale and shocking enough to make his mind dazed. No. What stood in front of him was a being, so similar to Ichigo in its height and hair color, yet so different in a bony hollow mask covering its whole face and a white color of its skin. Because of the dense and violent energy previously surrounding it, its upper body was nude, revealing a small hole in the middle of its chest that was slowly growing larger. It was a hollow. This is one bad déjà vu. Ishaine whispered and tightened the grip on his sword. His action, however, seemingly woke the hollow from its inactivity and caused it to release a thunderous roar. It was accompanied with a release of even more Ryuryoku that crawled and swirled around the two swords in the hollow's hands. In a flash, the hollow changed his location and released an incredibly dense crescent-shaped wave of energy that made Ishaine gulp. He didn't even think about the potential outcome of him trying to block it and dodged it with a shunpo. The attack crashed into the Sekizeki-imbued walls with so much force, it cracked them with the pure amount of physical pressure. When he saw that, Ishaine felt goosebumps. To actually damage Sekizeki mineral, just how strong. But Ishaine had not time to marvel at it as the hollow appeared right next to him with every intention to cleave him in two halves. Acting fast, Ishaine raised his sword and managed to block the strike, but he was still blasted to the side. Crashing into the wall like a bullet, he felt like a crumpled piece of paper. The wall behind him gave in to the impact and caved in a bit. I don't remember it being this powerful. Is it because of Ichigo? He was able to pry himself out just in time to evade a heavy-looking punch that further damaged the wall to the point of it slowly beginning to crumble. The follow-up sideways slash forced him to lean backwards and jump away. Even from the distance, he noticed the hollow hole was now large enough for a human hand to pass through. This is bad. With a somber look, he released his energy and called out to his Zanpakuto. Burn, Injutsu. As soon as his now heavier Ryutsu reached the hollow, it caused the creature to howl and send, in a quick succession, a series of energy-based attacks Ishine refused to acknowledge as Getsuga. In return, with a deeply worried frown, Ishine sliced the air in front of him as well. Getsuga Tensho. The dark black and bright blue collided in a violent explosion so potent, Ishine was forced to back all the way to the wall in order not to get caught up in it. Even then, the shockwave squashed him against the wall for more than just a second. When it died down, he felt something sharp cutting through the upper part of his right shoulder, creating a bleeding gash. Ugh, what was his smaller sword? He exclaimed, surprised to see one of the hollow swords buried in the wall next to his right eye. Immediately, he realized he was lucky only his shoulder got injured. He's really trying to kill me. He saw the hollow rushing at him. I'm sorry, Ichigo. This will probably hurt a lot. Reaching to his injured shoulder with his left hand, he smeared his palm with his own blood and then brought it to his face. While keeping an eye on the hollow, he licked off the blood and spit it on the blade of his Zanpakuto. A large wave of hot spiritual energy began to emanate from it almost instantly. Hesitating only for a split second, he brought his Zanpakuto down and released the whole energy at the hollow in one fell swoop. Even if the hollow was incredibly fast, Ishine knew that from this up close, there was no way his strike could have been avoided. True to his words, the strike connected and swallowed the hollow whole. Roasting and gnawing at it, it spat it out only after the energy dissipated. When that happened, Ishine dared to take a look. Damn! The hollow was scorched and one of its legs had been cut off at the base of its thigh, but it felt like the damage wasn't enough. A roar later, the hollow was once again brimming with incredible energy and the limb already began to regrow. High-speed regeneration. Ishine bit his lip. So he's just like a hollow now. He muttered in an incredibly worried tone and steeled himself. He knew what he had to do. In order to bring the hollow to a certain shop in human world, he had to beat it close to death. Otherwise, the hollow would interfere. Nothing else, just a complete and brutal beatdown. He gulped. Could he do it? Could he do that to his son? To the last piece of past memory of once happy family? Even if it was for Ichigo's own good, Ishine felt torn. He didn't want to increase his son's suffering. He steeled himself one more time. It was not the time to think about things. Ichigo's future wasn't going to be pretty either way. The sooner he learned that, the better. Zzzzzzzzzzzzz. Refocusing his sight back at the hollow, Ishine felt his blood freezing. One of the hollow's arms was raised and pointed directly at him. The clawed fingertips of its hand were pointing to a one point, and in it, the creature seemed to be charging a bright red orb of dense Ryoryoku. Ishine recognized it. Zero. In what seemed like an instant, the orb exploded and shot straight at him. Expanding into a wide arc, the blast left Ishine no place to run away from it, and the captain of the 10th Division was forced to take it head-on. GH. A grunt escaped his mouth when the attack collided with him. He could feel the pressure pushing him backwards until his back connected with the wall and then squashed him against it. The raw energy behind the blast scorched his skin and he smelled burnt hair. His clothes were torn a little, but he managed to withstand the zero without losing his consciousness. However, as soon as the attack died down, Ishine felt a sturdy fist sinking into his guts and his back was pushed further into the wall. Before he could regain his composure and start defending himself, he received one more punch and the wall behind him finally gave in to the pressure. It collapsed, but, in a rare instance of luck, it happened only after the force behind the punch died down. I can't let him out of this area. He managed to bring his Zanpakuto down. Getsuga Tensho. The hollow was blown away, but it gave Ishine barely a second of peace as it already rushed back at him. One of its arms did not survive the Getsuga, but the high-speed regeneration seemed to be kicking in already. What tenacity! He parried several fast swipes, but the fight quickly fell into a stalemate. While Ishine was powerful and skilled, the hollow was pulling incredible amounts of energy seemingly from nowhere. It made tiring him out extremely difficult. This can't go on for any longer. The training area was beginning to fall into pieces. Filled with craters, fissures, ripped ground, and heavily damaged walls, it was at its last breath. What is going on here? Cold sweat formed on Ishaine's forehead when he heard the voice coming from the one hole in the wall. The hollow Ryotsu, it seeped through the hole. The one standing next to the hole was the captain of the 6th Division, Kukaki Byakuya. But, to Ishaine's horror, he was not alone but accompanied with captains of the 3rd and 7th Division respectively. Gah! The moment of carelessness cost Ishaine a long cut across his torso. Don't come in here! He yelled heatedly and retaliated with a heavy blow that briefly stopped the hollow from advancing. His sword locked in a battle for dominance, Ishaine poured more energy into it. Getsuga Tensho! Arg! His Getsuga exploded in the hollow's face, but to his shock, the hollow also sneaked an attack of his own. An energy blast hit Ishaine into his left side and knocked him towards the hole in the wall. Captain Shiba! I'm fine! Ishaine exclaimed and tried to get on his feet. But the damage had been done and he could feel at least few of his ribs broken and his skin burnt. He ignored it, pushed through the pain and looked up, at the hollow. The creature with a mask covering its whole head stood in the center of the training area and stared directly into his eyes. Ichigo! Releasing a loud and angry roar, the hollow suddenly swiped the air around him with his clawed fingers and opened a small rift in it. Before Ishaine managed to say anything else, the hollow jumped into it and the rift closed. Just like that, he vanished. Tired and defeated, Ishaine fell on his knees. Ichigo. Chapter 28, Dark Side of the Moon, Horse of War. Alone in his private room, Ishaine stared at a picture hanging on the wall with a somber and tired expression. It had barely been an hour since he had woken up from a short and uncomfortable sleep, but his mind was already in one big mess. In times like these, Ishaine knew of only one way to calm himself down. It was to talk to the woman of his life. I really screwed this up, huh, Masaki? He quietly spoke to a large and happy face printed in the picture, half expecting a kind and warm response in return. But there was no answer, just silence. After a few seconds, he found himself unable to look at the bright smile and lowered his head. In shame. In guilt. I guess me and Ryukin aren't that different after all. We are both shitty dads. A deep sigh crawled from his chest. I just thought, he was doing so well, you know? It never crossed my mind that he would or could lose himself to this degree. That his emotions were so out of control. I thought I knew him better than that. He dared to look up, at the picture, again. When he did, a small sad chuckle escaped his mouth. Yeah, I know. It's not the end of the world. No matter what, he's still our son. I know that Kisuke has been prepared for this possibility for a long time, but that's not what's bothering me. He said while shaking his head. He can become whatever he wants and I'll still love him. It's where he went that worries me. Feeling his throat getting dry, he reached for his half-empty glass and took a gulp of water out of it. Then he glanced at a small piece of paper innocently staring at him from his right side and sighed once more. I don't think I can keep this a secret for any longer. There were witnesses, and even though the Sekizeki kept Ichigo's hollow Ryotsu contained within the training ground almost till the end, it still washed over half of Sirei. They all know something odd happened. He muttered and peeked out the window, to see officers running from place to place in a hurry. But I guess it's going to depend on the old man. He gulped down the rest of the glass's contents and, after grabbing the piece of paper, stood up. With a third sigh, he corrected his clothes and walked out of the room. Once out, he immediately aimed his steps towards the 1st Division. While on the way, he tried to clear his mind as much as he could. Being emotional wasn't going to help him. A few minutes later he knocked on the doors of the captain commander's office and walked right in. Before the commander could get upset at the sudden interruption, Ishaine raised the hand in which he was still holding the crumpled piece of paper and waved it at him. You wanted to see me, sir? What in the, yes. Sit down, Captain Shiba. From behind his desk, Yamamoto said in a tone Ishaine found fairly confusing. Nevertheless, he quickly closed the doors, walked to the desk and obediently sat down. He saw Yamamoto giving him an extremely long look. I wanted to talk to you before we begin the captain's meeting. I think you understand why, don't you? Ishaine nodded. I do, sir. In response to Ishaine's reply, Yamamoto placed both his hands at his chin and slightly covered his mouth with them. Then he closed his eyes. "What in the world were you thinking, you damn fool?" Yamamoto raised neither his voice nor his Ryutsu, yet Ishine still flinched. The disappointed tone of the commander's voice felt like a punch to the guts, and it caused the already beaten Ishine to feel like an old man. Old, irresponsible and foolish man. He opened his mouth, only for Yamamoto to interrupt him with a raised hand. "Do you recall the conversation we had after you returned to the Soul Society a month or two ago?" Ishine dared to look him in the eye and tried to recall the day he had decided to leave the human world and return to the place he was born in. "Sir." Yamamoto's gaze seemed to pierce right through him. "You vowed for your son, saying he was an important asset for the Soul Society. You also explained the reason behind Aizen Sosuke's interest in him. Despite these, you just served him your son like a fine wine on a silver plate. You let him turn into a mindless hollow and let him escape into Hueco Mundo. If I didn't know you better, Shiba, this would almost feel like a sabotage. Or maybe I am wrong and you and Urahara Kisuke have been planning this even before you returned." The fact that Yamamoto decided to let something like that slip through his teeth hurt Ishine's fatherly pride greatly. He gathered his courage and looked at the commander with a hard gaze. "I would never do that to my son," he said in a deadly serious tone, causing Yamamoto to nod in satisfaction. "Yes, you wouldn't," the commander said in a way that suggested something Ishine didn't like to even think about. "Still, you let it happen and I have every right to punish you for that." Ishine blinked. "But you won't." Yamamoto tapped the top of his cane. "No, at least not at the moment. For the foreseeable future, the Godai needs to be as strong as possible, and I already have one severely restricted captain. However, your actions are already having consequences. Shirai is in chaos. Never before has a hollow Ryutsu entered its walls and everyone is talking about it. I'm afraid we reached an unavoidable conclusion, Shiba. You must explain this to your fellow captains. They need to know what happened so they can think of something to calm their men down," he said with a firm gaze. Before Ishine could respond, he continued. "However, there is one thing this situation showed me." Ishine looked at him questioningly. "Your son truly may be an asset. Forcing one of my finer captains to fight at almost full power means he is getting strong. There is no more doubt in my mind about it. I suppose you do have a plan on turning him back, else you wouldn't be this calm." Surprised at the commander's words, Ishine was briefly speechless. After a moment, he recovered. "Yes, sir. Kisuke had it ever since Ichigo died as a human." "Sir, does this mean you'll allow me to bring him back?" Yamamoto didn't answer immediately. First, he looked towards Shirai and, only after seemingly nodding to himself, he looked back. "I haven't decided who will go for him yet, but I already know you won't be it, Shiba. Sir Dash." But Yamamoto shook his head. "Your son is now, for all intents and purposes, a hollow." Seeing his father, a person who could be reflected on his mask, would only trigger an aggressive response from him. "Moreover, I don't believe you could go all out on him." "You will not go, Shiba. That is my final decision." Realizing the commander wouldn't budge, Ishine was forced to give up. He wanted to rage, to object, and refuse, but he knew it too well. He knew it would be pointless. Once Yamamoto decided on something, not even the entirety of Soul Society could change his mind. Furthermore, Ishine kind of expected such a reaction. Yamamoto's logic was sound and solid. Seeing Ichigo would only cause both him and his son more distress. But deep down, he had hoped for a different outcome. "Yes, sir." Satisfied, Yamamoto quietly called for his vice captain. "Let him in." When he heard that, Ishine looked up, only to see the doors to the office opening. A single person walked through them. A person whose presence made Ishine's mood go awry. "You called for me, Commander?" the newcomer asked. "Yes, Captain Kuratsuki." The captain of the 12th Division waltzed into the room with his usual smirk, but when he noticed Ishine, that smirk widened. Surprisingly though, it wasn't followed by any sarcastic remark. "Did you take a look at it?" Ishine raised an eyebrow. It felt like he shouldn't have been in the office anymore, Yet the commander never told him to leave. He sent the man a questioning gaze and Yamamoto briefly closed his eyes. I told Captain Kurotsuka the truth. That the hollow in Siridi was your son. You what? Briefly forgetting about protocol, Ishine exclaimed in alarm. Captain of the 12th Division was the last person he wanted to know about Ichigo. It should have been impossible for your son to escape to Hueco Mundo from within Siridi, so I immediately contacted Captain Kurotsuka for an answer. Yamamoto explained while Mayuri picked his note in boredom. So noisy. Don't worry, Shiba, I have no interest in your foolish son. The captain of the 12th Division muttered. Then he turned to Yamamoto and his bored expression turned irritated. I did look into it and it made no sense. Not that long ago, I added an additional special layer to the dimensional wall that should have prevented situations like this from happening. Well, it seems like it's not working very well. Yamamoto grunted, making Mayuri's expression to change further. With an unpleasant grimace, Mayuri tried to calm the twitch in his left eyebrow. I assure you that is not the case. I designed it myself after a long and deep research of the dimensional rifts. It is working perfectly. Its inner workings are simulating the capabilities of an artificial brain that is almost on my level. However, he trailed off and glanced at Ishine, who tried to look neutral. A moment later, he rubbed his chin and let his previous expression to slowly melt. My security measures work with static characteristics of Ryotsu signatures. By design, it is hard to compute more than just slight changes in real time. However, when I compared the older records of the boy's Ryotsu I got from the academy, an odd fact popped up. The boy's Ryuryoku and the resulting Ryotsu signature changed over time so much, my system was barely able to evaluate and allocate it to one person. If he completely transformed into a hollow, it is no wonder my system was unable to recognize him. Still, he trailed off again and started to pace around the office. Foreign signature triggers a different security measure, but, in the boy's case, that one never activated itself. So he existed outside the protocol yet also within the system. All of a sudden, Mayuri froze in his tracks and almost robotically turned to Yamamoto, who, in return, narrowed his eyes. What is it? It's as if he briefly became a fake administrator. Mayuri muttered in disbelief. Ignoring Yamamoto's confused stare, the scientist turned to Ishine and pierced him with a sharp glare. What are you hiding about him, Captain Shiba? Who or what exactly is your son? In the back of his head, Ishine felt an alarm instantly going off. What do you mean? Mayuri gave him a dirty look. Don't play dumb with me. Your son did something that cannot be done. A mere Shinigami is unable to override not just mine but also the default security measures of Soul Society with just his Ryuryoku alone. He did something that goes beyond simple science. It is unthinkable that such a barbarian could achieve something outside my intellectual dash. Captain Kurotsuka. A hard loud tap on the ground accompanied with a burst of warm Ryotsu forced the scientist to abandon his trail of thoughts and to quiet down. The man visibly bit the inside of his jaw, hard enough for his chewing muscles to show, and looked at Yamamoto. Lessening the grip on his cane, the captain commander gave him a short nod. I suppose I gave you too little time to analyze the situation. Maybe you simply overlooked some small detail that could easily explain all of this. I'm giving you a day to redo your report. Mayuri narrowed his eyes. It was clear that Yamamoto was ending the conversation with that, and the scientist was not one bit happy. I see. Was all he said. Yamamoto kept looking at him for a while longer. Then he glanced at Ishine. It is time for the captain's meeting. With that said, the three of them left the office and walked towards the assembly hall together, but in silence. Even if Ishine had some other things he wished to discuss with Yamamoto, he didn't want to do it in front of the captain of the 12th Division. Once they arrived to the assembly hall, they found the rest of the Godai captains already waiting for them. The three of them took their places and Yamamoto tapped the floor with his cane once more. I hereby start today's captain's meeting. Immediately after that, he raised his Ryotsu output to silence any possible interruptions or sudden outbursts. The latest incident certainly left all of you with questions, and so I will start by addressing them. But it is not I who will explain the situation to you. Captain Shiba, if you will. He didn't even need to call Ishine out as everyone's eyes had been at him ever since he entered the room. Rumors in Siridi spread fast. Taking a deep breath, Ishine steeled himself for the inevitable. In his mind, he apologized to Ichigo. "I'm sorry, son. I guess this is it. The breaking point." Over the next 5 minutes, he factually explained what happened at his spar with Ichigo as well as what happened to Ichigo himself. That his only son was not just a simple Shinigami but also a hybrid being who was in possession of a hollow entity within him. But that was also everything he decided to reveal. A short glance at Yamamoto's neutral face told him that he was right and that he didn't need to continue, and for that, Ishine was very thankful. Some things were best not told without proper reason, and with what he had just revealed, he suspected opinions on Ichigo would quickly turn ugly. A few moments later that suspicion turned out to be spot on. "What? Your son is a hollow? Now, let's all calm down dash. Unacceptable." There were 1 or 2 voices trying to lessen the burden on the already stressed captain of the 10th Division, but the majority drowned them like a drop of water that dissipates in an ocean. Yamamoto quickly took action and tapped the ground with his cane. Hard. Silence. Thump. A wave of scorching hot riot washed over the room with enough intensity to prevent anyone from speaking any further. The resulting silence lasted for an uncomfortably long moment. "You knew, didn't you, Yamaji?" Only one person dared to speak in such occasions, and this wasn't an exception. With his hat tipped to the side, Shunsui revealed his somber expression and a few bags under his eyes. The man looked quite drained, but there was still a twinkle of sharp intellect hidden in his surprisingly dark stare. "Yes. Captain Shiba told me the same day he returned to Siridi. And you decided it was in Ichigo-kun's best interest to keep it a secret." Yamamoto slightly opened one of his eyes and narrowed it at his former pupil. He was not used to Shunsui using such aggressive sarcasm. "I made a decision based on what was at that moment best for the Soul Society, Captain Kiraku." His stern response took some wind from Shunsui's sails and allowed for another person, the captain of the 7th Division, Komamura Seijin, to speak up. "Nobody is questioning you, Genri Usaidano, but this is an important piece of information. What if he used his hollow side on innocent souls? What if he used it while at the academy? The boy is a walking abomination. By the laws of Soul Society he sh. That's rich coming from a beast, eh?" Kenpeki interrupted him without an inch of shame or guilt, causing Komamura to glance in his direction with an unreadable expression. The captain of the 7th Division slowly reached for the helmet on his head, the helmet he had been wearing ever since appearing in the Soul Society, and took it down. By doing so, he revealed his anthropomorphic self. A man with a wolf head. "How did you know?" Everyone knew, but nobody spoke a shit because it doesn't matter what you are. The only thing that matters is whether you can fight or not. Kenpeki retorted, stunning not just Komamura with his precise treading. To be fair, young Kurosaka's circumstances are a bit different to those of Captain Komamura. Anohana piped in. "So then you agree with him? That Kurosaka-san is an abomination?" Yukatake asked with his tone rising. "No, of course not. But he is still a liability that should have been kept in safe area. If what Captain Shiba said is true and Kurosaka's Zanpakuto spirit itself is partly a hollow, then he shouldn't have become a Shinigami in first place." Toshiro stated and tried not to look at Ishine. "That's a bit harsh, Captain Hitsugaya. Remember my Bakuto? I am as much of a liability as Kurosaki is, yet here I am, standing next to all of you, accepted and forgiven." Amagai butted in with a shrug. "Disgrace." A quiet, yet firm, voice came out from near Yamamoto and forced Ishine to look at its owner. "Captain Sui Feng." Sui Feng was looking at Ishine with a disturbed, slightly confused expression that threw the man out of the loop. "You are a captain of the Godi 13. Why didn't you knock him out before he escaped?" Somewhere at the back of his mind, Ishine knew there was something odd about Sui Feng's words, but, at that time, he was in too much stress to put the pieces together. "I tried, but he just wouldn't stay down. The only way I could have done it is by killing him. Also, the more power he uses, the stronger his hollow influence, which means high-speed regeneration and a dense arrow. Moreover, when he completely turned, he became too unpredictable. He hurriedly explained. Su Yifeng pursed her lips and looked away from him with contempt. As the multiple conversations continued with no end in sight, Yamamoto allowed himself a deep sigh. At the same time, in a different room, a group of high-ranking Shinigami officers held their own, unofficial meeting. Most of them were of the second highest rank, a vice captain, but there were also those who didn't even have a numbered position. However, they all had one thing in common. Worries. I can't believe it. How did a hollow get in Siriti unnoticed? A sharp-looking man in black sunglasses shook his head in disbelief. His name was Tetsuzumon Iba and he was a vice-captain of the 7th Division. When he felt several stares, the man reached for his glasses and took them down. What? Sighing from a chair in the corner of the room, Nanao Ise, the vice-captain of the 8th Division, gave him an exasperated look. So you haven't heard about it? Hear what? Iba asked and looked around, but it looked like nobody wanted to answer his question. The vice-captain of the 2nd Division, Mareki Yoomada, just picked his nose with a bored expression. The vice-captain of the 3rd Division, Izuru Kira, continued to look at the ground beneath his feet with a somber expression. The vice-captain of the 4th Division, Isane Katetsu, nervously glanced from one to another. The vice-captain of the 5th Division was not present. Renji sat in a corner with his eyes deeply closed. Hisagi's head was pressed against his hands, tightly entwined with each other, and he stared into nothingness. Rangiku continuously filled her glass with sake and then drank it. Nimue stood in another corner completely quiet while the only person representing the 13th Division, Rukia, quickly avoided his look. Nanao was the only one who seemed to be forming any answer, but then the door to the room opened and revealed 3 additional officers. All of them belonged to the 11th Division. The one walking in front was a little girl with pink hair and a cheerful smile, the vice-captain of the 11th Division, Yachiro. She was also the one who finally answered Iba's question. Ken-chan told me. It was Ikki. However, Iba blinked in confusion. Who? Ichigo. She's talking about Ichigo. From behind Yachiro, Ikeko said and gave Iba a long and meaningful stare until the man understood. The one you've told me so much about, huh? What about him? Ikeko lowered his eyes and shook his head. That hollow in Siriti? It was Ichigo. He turned into a hollow. The whole room seemingly flinched and almost everyone released the collective breath they didn't know they were holding in. So far, not one of them had wanted to say it out loud, but now, when the elephant was finally out of the basket, they could finally show their emotions and their opinions on the matter. Damn it! Iba blinked in surprise and fell onto his chair. But, how is this possible? Ikeko shrugged. I don't think I can explain it. Nobody in this room can, but, maybe, just maybe, there is a person who could at least try to. Am I right, Kukiki? Until now etched deep into her chair and satisfied with listening to the conversation around her, Rukia suddenly felt smaller than she really was. Intense stares came at her from every side and pushed her even deeper into the chair, until she felt like she and the chair were one. What's there to explain? It's no surprise that Ichigo is like that. A lone voice came to Rukia's help and she looked at its owner in surprise. It was Renji. He was looking at a wall, but the intent in his heightened ryotsu was clear. He was talking to them. You are probably the only one who thinks that, Vice-Captain Abarai. Nanao objected, causing Renji to frown a little. With a slight twitch of his muscles, Renji turned his head and glanced at her. No, I'm not, because I'm not the only one who has felt Ichigo's released Ryuryoku before. If you did, you would know he was never quite ordinary. Heh, you may be right. When I think about it, I did feel something weird within his Ryuryoku every time he released his Zanpakuto in our spars. Ikeko said after a moment of silence and peeked at Yumi Chika, standing next to him. Truly. Be that as it may, it is still a shocking news for the rest of us, and I, for the record, don't know how I feel about this. I know Captain Kiraka likes him, but... Nanao said with narrowed eyes. For the record, I know. Ichigo is a good guy. That's all I need to know. Renji retorted curtly. Could you say the same thing if he went on a rampage and killed humans or somebody you knew? Somebody you loved? Renji froze. The quiet voice of the 3rd Division's vice captain, a person who went to the academy with him, sounded extremely loud and left a bitter taste in his mouth. His words reminded Renji things he didn't want to recall. That isn't fair, Kira-kun. Rangiku put her glass on the table and gave Kira a sad glance. Ichigo didn't chose this, just so you know. Rukia suddenly said and quickly brought all attention back at herself. Watching the situation unfold, she felt a twitch of angry fire within her. Yes, he possesses some hollow Ryuryoku, but he was born this way. He did not undergo hollowification. She revealed sternly, creating a long moment of silence in the room until a bittersweet chuckle startled everyone and made them look at the one who released it, the vice captain of the 9th Division, Hisagi, in surprise. Shaking his head, the man briefly closed his eyes. Doomed forever to fight for control of his own self. No wonder Captain Commander put him in my division. Oblivion truly suits him well. Meanwhile, in a certain shop somewhere in Karakura town, a man wearing wooden sandals and a bucket hat patiently waited on the phone, listening to the sound of silence, until the other side finally decided to pick up his call. Yes. It's me. I need to talk to Hirako-san. A response came almost immediately. Kisuke. Right. Hold on. While waiting for the person he wished to speak to, Urahara subconsciously tapped the table with his index finger and kept glancing at the computer screen placed right in front of him. His expression was devoid of a smile, and every time he read the few lines on the screen, his brow creased in a frown. Yes? What do ya want? Hearing the familiar voice did nothing to ease Urahara, and he squeezed the phone. Bad news, Hirako-san. TCH, how many times did I ask ya to call me Shinji? Urahara ignored the remark. He turned. For a minute, there was a silence on the other side of the line. I see. So? What do you want to do? It's still within the scopes of your plans, right? Urahara glanced at the computer screen once more and, in quick succession, pushed several buttons. The screen changed and a large bar that was filling itself at an incredibly slow pace appeared in its center. The only information written on it was 4% and counting. Yes. I have something for this occasion, but it'll take at least a day before it's ready. Until it can be used to get him back, I'd like you to get ready. Even though he couldn't see him, Urahara was sure the man on the other side of the line instantly frowned. For what? I told you we won't come out just because dash. That's not what I meant. Urahara didn't give him a chance to finish and quickly interrupted him in a strong tone. Then what did you mean? Urahara shifted on his chair and rubbed the stubble on his chin. I'd like you to take him under your tutelage and teach him how to control that part of him. In the phone, he heard a click of a tongue. Kisuke. It doesn't have to be for long. Just give him some pointers, some direction in which he should go on his own so this situation won't repeat itself again. He wasn't trying to press the other man, but he certainly wasn't going to back down easily either. The expression on his face didn't change and he patiently waited until he heard the response he had wanted to hear. Fine. But don't expect a miracle, Kisuke. Despite everything that has happened to us, we are a long shot from being experts in this area. Letting out a quiet snort, Urahara thanked the man and put down the phone. Shaking his head, he looked at his own feet. A miracle is the last thing I want to see, Hirako-san. Hueco Mundo, several hours before. A small hollow with a lizard-like appearance lazily crawled through the dunes of a seemingly endless white desert while being illuminated by a strange moon hovering in the sky. The hollow didn't mind that it never saw the light of the day. The never-ending night of Hueco Mundo was comforting and pleasantly cold. The air was oversaturated with Ryuryoku, and so it never felt the need to visit the human world. It was satisfied with the air alone. Because of that, the creature couldn't know that the moon in Hueco Mundo was always in the opposite lunar cycle compared to its counterpart in the world of the living. However, even if it knew, such information wouldn't have mattered to it. Its primitive logic was driven by one thing and one thing only: to satisfy its hunger. And so it crawled, dug, jumped, and slithered through the sand, from time to time enjoying the small particles tickling the scaly skin of its small body. The hollow's small body was also one of its best attributes. Because of it, it never needed too much food to lessen the urge to eat, and it also served it as the best protection. As the other hollows were mostly large, to them, the lizard hollow was just a waste of time and eating it would be pointless. Thanks to that, the creature never had to feel fear and it never fell into a dangerous situation. Unfortunately, that made it unprepared for its sudden demise when a white leg suddenly stomped on it after jumping out of a newly formed Gargantagate. The lizard hollow only managed to hiss once before its body cracked under the pressure and turned into a sloppy, sloshy mess of spiritual particles. Gray. The one who killed it was a bulky humanoid hollow with white skin, long straight orange hair, a hollow mask slowly covering its whole head and a hollow hole in the middle of its bare chest. The lower part of its body was covered in something that looked like remnants of Shinigami clothing. In its clawed hands the creature held two swords, one a lot larger than the other one. Its eyes, hidden deep within its mask, stared into the distance until it noticed the spiritual particles from the lizard hollow. The creature looked down and raised its right leg, but it was too late for the lizard hollow. With a slight turn of its head, the humanoid hollow stared at the remaining particles for a while longer, until some of the Ryuryoku got into its nostrils. The white humanoid hollow blinked as a strange emotion ran across its body, slowly burning him from within with its intensity. Hunger. It quickly crouched and tried to breathe in more of the spiritual particles from the small hollow, but a light breeze came in and blew it away with a cynical smile on its non-existent face. Reacting immediately, the creature arched its head back and released a thunderous roar of anger so raw, it made the resulting echoes continue for a long time. The rage swelled in its chest like a freshly pumped balloon, ready to burst and violently explode. It made the creature hungrier and very thirsty. Thirsty for blood. It wanted to kill. It needed to kill. 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 Graya. Releasing another roar, the creature raised both its swords and smashed them into the ground beneath it with so much force, it blasted some of the sand away. Not even a second later, the creature felt its feet trembling when the ground itself began to shake. Curious, it looked down, only to see cracks forming all around it. Once an ominous noise reverberated across the dunes, the ground caved in and sent the creature flying down like a meteorite. For a very brief time, the anger was replaced with a stroke of elation. Then the creature's left side collided with a tall column and painfully ricocheted from it. The elation vanished and the anger returned in full force. Still falling down, the creature encountered several more of such columns until it finally crash-landed on the ground. Despite its hard skin and powerful build, the impact shook the hollow's very core, and so it decided not to immediately stand up and smash the columns into pieces but to rest for a while and let the high-speed regeneration do its thing. Though, with its face buried in the sand, the creature didn't see a mass of Minos Grande slowly approaching its location. Baaaaaaa. A quiet but strong hum filled the dark place as soon as Minos came close enough for the creature to feel their spiritual energy. The state of elation returned and, with its face still in sand, the creature formed a terrifying grin. It was time to eat. With incredible speed, it pushed itself off the ground and briefly let go of its swords to deliver a series of fast-paced punches accompanied with a release of Ryuryoku pulses. While not as powerful as a Zero, the pulses traveled a lot faster and smashed through Minos' large bodies before the monsters could react. With such critical injuries, Minos toppled over and fell right next to the creature's feet. Before more of them could come close, the creature jumped on those on the ground and buried its face in them, tearing and ripping them into shreds with its own teeth. The creature gulped down the matter and licked its mouth. The Ryuryoku from Minos wasn't exactly tasteful or rich in nutrition, but it was enough to replenish at least some of the energy reserves. Still, it wasn't nearly enough to satisfy the urge. More. It needed more. A familiar sound entered the creature's ears and caused it to quickly jump backwards. In that moment, a bright red beam of energy obliterated the place, as well as the unfinished meal in front of it. Anger seeped into the creature's veins. Looking up, it noticed a group of another Minos slowly approaching him with their mouths hanging open, and so it quickly grabbed its swords. The sound of Zero filled the area yet again. Multiple beams shot straight at the creature, but, using the swords as a shield, the creature escaped most of the danger. When the energy from the strike dissipated, the creature narrowed its eyes in a smug smirk and kicked the ground. With the sound of a sonic boom, it leaped at the approaching Minos and began to systematically hack and slash anything and everything that stood in its way before another volley of Zero could hit it. Bisected bodies, cleaved masks, gaping holes, the creature was no stranger to none. Every time it incapacitated an enemy, its sharp teeth bit a good chunk out of the dying body. Ryuryoka filled the creature's mouth and caused it to almost gleam in satisfaction. Soon enough, even the last Minos fell on the ground, defeated and partially consumed. With spiritual particles dripping down from its mask, the creature formed a grin. The hunger had receded a little. The excruciating pain turned into an unpleasant but manageable throbbing. Nevertheless, the thirst for battle remained the same and denied the creature a peace of mind. Its instincts were quietly whispering tempting words, seducing it towards the path of a bloodbath and mass slaughter, the path of destruction. Halt! Hearing an actual voice caused the creature to instantly twist around and point its eyes towards the source of the sound. There, in a short distance, stood an unknown hollow. It had a shell-like appendage on its back and a hollow hole located on the left side of its chest. Moreover, unlike Minos Grande, the hollow seemed a bit smaller. At the same time, the spiritual pressure radiating from it was a lot stronger than any Minos. It caused the orange-haired creature to widen its terrifying grin. The stronger the opponent, the better the battle. However, the other hollow quickly realized its intentions. I am the guardian of the forest of Minos, the place that surrounds us. I can sense your bloodlust, but I wouldn't advise you to attack me. Judging from your Ryotsu and appearance, you may very well be a Vastolord, but it would still be unwise. The other hollow, a self-appointed guardian, announced a moment before a group of hollows, similar in size, appeared from behind him. Come on, don't joke like that. There is no way a Vastolord would appear here. A different hollow with protrusions in his elbows said in exasperation. The guardian narrowed his eyes and gave the orange-haired creature a stare. Yes, it is very improbable, but not impossible. Tell me, what is your name? The creature looked at the guardian and let out a quiet growl. It didn't attack, though. So far, it just stared at the unpleasant company with its undying grin. He can't even speak. I agree, he can't be a Vastolord. Another hollow muttered slowly, prompting the guardian to narrow his eyes even further. He also appears to be wearing some clothes that reek of Shinigami. Interesting. Seeing as he's so pale, I think we should him white. In that moment, the orange-haired creature, White, flinched and recoiled, almost as if physically hit. Something strange, an odd feeling, ran across his body and caused echoes of thoughts to swirl within his head. It made him nauseous and incredibly pissed off at the same time. Rage, hunger, and thirst erupted along with an ascent in his instinct and sent a surge of Ryuryoka through his whole body. Within a second, his body shook and a faint aura enveloped both his swords. The mask on his face grew to the point where it encased his whole head like a helmet and, along with that, peculiar black markings burst out of his hollow hole, turning his chest into a canvas for an image of a black sun. What just happened? The guardian didn't react to the question and carefully eyed White with curious eyes. Doing so saved his life a fraction of a second later, when White appeared right in front of him with one of his swords falling down on him like a guillotine. The guardian barely avoided the strike and allowed a large kyber sword to embed itself deep into a body of an unfortunate hollow that had been standing right behind him. In one fell swoop, the sudden attack bisected the unfortunate hollow like it was made from a jelly. White's teeth buried themselves into one of the halves before it could hit the ground. Damn it! Without a warning, a thick, bony protrusion aiming for White's head shot through the air until his clawed hand caught it mid-air and crushed it into a dust. The shy attempt was quickly followed with two bright zero blasts, but at that point, White was already on the move. Once he swallowed the small portion of the dead hollow's body, the aura surrounding his swords grew in intensity and made his appearance even more feral than before. Gyarg. The smaller of White's swords, along with his whole hand, blasted through another unfortunate hollow that tried to strike him from the back and caused the hollow to release a howl full of pain. Grinning like a maniac, White immediately retracted his hand and gave the gaping hole in the hollow's chest a satisfied glance. Then he jumped at the hollow's shoulder and bit a good portion away. Just as he was about to gulp down the spiritual particles, White felt several long appendages wrapping around his whole body in an attempt to immobilize him. Slowly turning his head, he threw the guardian, the one using the appendages, a dangerous glare. Jillians. Sensing an influx of Ryotsu, White slightly tilted his head and looked around to see more than a dozen Minos Grandae surrounding him with their mouths wide open. He also noticed a few of the smaller hollows following the fashion. "Don't kill him, though. Giving him to Las Noches could bring us some nice benefits," the Guardian said right before a shower of bright heavy energy descended upon White like an avalanche. The combined force of several Zero caused them to detonate in a powerful explosion that swirled the sand and created a small dust storm all around the place. When the air cleared, it revealed White kneeling on the only leg he had left. His larger sword was lying next to him, as he did not have his right arm. From the elbow down, instead of an arm there were only remains of a bone. However, to the Guardian's ire, White's grin never faded away. Now, a few hollows decided it was the time to completely knock White down and leaped straight at him, only to get blasted away when he expelled a tremendous amount of Ryuryoka from his body that caused the sand around him to evaporate. At the same time, his limbs began to regrow at a fast pace. Clicking his tongue, the Guardian instantly stretched the appendages from his back only to be forced to fall back when White's smaller sword almost split his head in two. Glaring at the Guardian, White's body glimmered in a red aura and his mouth slowly opened. An overwhelming roar reverberated through the forest of Minos like a siren, a premonition of death, and caused every single Minos Grande to quickly turn around and flee in terror. The other hollows briefly froze and stared at him in fear. The Guardian was the only one who stubbornly refused to back down, but the drop of sweat on his forehead brought him to his senses. "Fall back." White faded out of existence, only to appear above one of the hollows with his regrown hand already smashing right through the unlucky victim's skull. It took him only a second to absorb the dead's essence. "Damn these newborn Ajichas. So weak." The Guardian muttered and watched as White tore through yet another hollow. The poor creature tried to put up a fight, but the difference in power was clear. "Zero for the escape. All of you," the Guardian stated and opened his mouth. Once an orb of energy formed at the tip of his tongue, he blasted it at White along with several others. One or two blasts managed to hit White, but the damage was superficial. Still, the force behind them slowed him down just enough for his enemies to scatter and flee. He still felt the traces of their spiritual energies but didn't try to follow them. Instead, he turned to the last hollow he slaughtered and bit into it with ravenous appetite. Once he was finished with his meal, he simply turned away and began walking forward. 2 days later, wandering through the forest of Minos had turned out to be fairly fruitful. While he hadn't encountered a single opponent that would have given him much trouble, White felt that the urge to kill was slowly decreasing with each passing hour and with every enemy he had slain. But the more he was roaming the not-so-proverbial forest, the less hollows he came across. Maybe those lucky ones that had survived encounter with him spread the word about him, or maybe it was because of his spiritual pressure that had been constantly rising. By the time he had returned to the hole in the sky through which he had come to the forest, White knew the Guardian was no longer the strongest hollow in there. The intelligent Ajichas had tried to attack him once more, but, to Guardian's surprise, Jillians had refused to aid him and fled away as soon as they had seen White glaring daggers at them. The Guardian had managed to escape again, but not before receiving life-threatening injuries to his whole body. White really wanted him to try his luck one last time, the thick taste of Guardian's spiritual energy causing him to lick his teeth. It had been the best meal he had so far. Not the tastiest, but definitely the most fulfilling. Looking at the hole high above him, White glanced at the trees, the large thick constructs he had thought to be just columns, that were scattered all around the forest, and growled quietly. While fond of the never-ending supply of food, he was slowly getting sick of the forest. Lowering himself a bit, he prepared to leap in the air. He gave the forest one last glance, when he noticed a small hollow walking around him in a small distance. For just a second, he locked eyes with him. No communication happened between them, but White still turned away from the creature and focused his attention on getting the angle of his jump right. In his mind, in the animalistic vortex of chaotic instincts, he knew he would have probably enjoyed killing the hollow. However, the slightly twisted yet humane logic of his thoughts convinced him to let the creature live. Why would he kill it now, if he could wait for it to get stronger and only then enjoy the fight that would surely turn out to be a lot better? With that in mind, White strained his legs and finally leaped in the air. The booming sound left in his wake echoed through the forest like a loud farewell. Grabbing a tree branch with his clawed hands, he repeatedly jumped from tree to tree until, barely a minute later, he hopped through the hole's edge and landed on the bright sand that held absolutely no warmth. For a second, he thought about how smaller the hole was compared to the moment when he had created it. Then the thought evaporated, replaced with the reflection of a moon that etched itself deeply into White's eyes. Subconsciously lowering his Ryotsu output, White felt something strange entering his body. Riding on his veins, the feeling quickly spread through his whole body like a poison that didn't hurt. At first, he tried to fight it. But when that didn't work, he changed the tactics and tried to understand it. But he was way over his head. That confusing feeling was something a creature like him could never comprehend. Not unless he acquired the one thing every hollow so desperately yearned for, the heart. Still, not being able to comprehend did not stop White from continuing to stare at the moon, the one thing that triggered the feeling. It was just so amazing. Monumental even. Staring at the moon slowly infected his mind and made him feel the same ecstasy he had felt while slaughtering his enemies. Hacking, cleaving, splitting bodies and spilling blood, all of that paled in comparison with the moon. It was never-ending, continuously arousing. Like warm blood dripping down from hungry mouth, the reflection of the moon made White feel alive. Like the metallic taste of fresh blood, the image of the heavenly object fulfilled his earthly desires. Guided by its light, White felt his legs moving. Not knowing where the journey would take him, White let go of his fighting instinct, his horse of war, and entered the void of his inner instinct. One step after another, he walked across the dunes of oblivion and ignored anything and everything around him. A Zero could blow straight through him and make a gaping hole in his stomach and he wouldn't have felt it. By the time he came to himself and regained at least some of his consciousness, he realized his steps took him to a place that looked like ruins of something. A wall here, a stairway there, the location felt foreign and almost evil, yet a part of White's psyche screamed at him to stay. That it was a place of comfort and that he would be safe there. Hovering his claws just above the ruins, he eventually found the highest place and sat right on it. With a peaceful mind, he leaned into a stone wall and let the moon reflect in his eyes once more. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there but, after some time, he felt as if something stung him in his side. It didn't hurt but he still felt it. Ire entered his serene mind and quickly evolved into a rage when he realized somebody invaded his safe heaven. He detected 2 Ryotsu signatures. Both stank. They stank like Shinigami. When he moved his head towards their sources, it was then when he received a devastating kick to the head. Sorry Ichigo. Kisuke said we don't have much time so this is going to hurt. A terrifying grimace creeped onto White's face as his urge to kill skyrocketed. Chapter 29, Scapegoat, Ablation. Earlier in Karakura town. Looking at the firearm in Yoriyuki's hand left Suifeng with a bad taste in her mouth. With a scowl, she looked away and pointed her eyes at the man who had handed them the item. So, this is what will turn Kurosaka back, Urahara Kisuke? Do we just shoot him till he drops? She asked roughly. For a moment, Urahara met her eyes and turned serious. Then he broke the eye contact. In one swift motion, he reached for the table next to him and grabbed a small vial full of thick, dark substance. Wordlessly, he pushed it in Yoriyuki's free hand. No. This firearm is actually a tranquilizer pistol. It should help you subdue young Kurosaka faster, though you still need to tire him out first for the tranquilizer to take effect. To actually turn him, I have prepared something else. The scientist explained and threw a fleeting gaze at a dimly lit door on his far right. Raising an eyebrow, Suifeng took a step towards it but Urahara quickly stepped in front of her. I'd rather have young Kurosaka here first. Suifeng stopped walking and glared at him with contempt, not even bothering to hide the hate she felt towards him. A soft hand touched her shoulder. I don't think we have time for this, Suifeng. With one of her eyes twitching, Suifeng looked away and pointed her stare at the firearm, still in Yoriyuki's hand. Her mouth formed a thin line. Will this work? Hollows have very high resistance against any form of sedatives. Not to mention they have to penetrate their naturally thick skin. Urahara shook his head. I took that into account. You should have no problem getting the drug into his system. However, like I said, It won't work if you don't tire him out first. See, the more Ryoryoku Kurosaka-san spends, the better and faster the effect gets. Though I feel I should warn you it will not last for long. Once he's down, you need to bring him to me as fast as you can. I see. Su Yifeng muttered and turned away only to take a few steps towards the underground area from where they were going to cross the Garganta. I still get to beat the shit out of him. Good. With wide eyes, Urahara glanced at Yoriyuki, who just shrugged. For some reason, she's incredibly pissed at the kid. She explained in a quiet voice, causing Urahara to snort humorlessly. Well, just make sure she doesn't overdo it. Yoriyuki formed a small smile and nodded to him. Then she started walking after Su Yifeng, only to hear Urahara's voice once more. Yoriyuki. Hueco Mundo is now Aizen's territory. He'll know you are there, so be quick and be careful. For just a second, Yoriyuki stopped walking and looked over her shoulder, to give Urahara an amused smirk. Who do you think you are talking to? Currently trained in ways of assassination and stealth, the female duo moved through the never-ending sands of Hueco Mundo unnoticed and with their Ryotsu kept as low as possible. Thanks to an additional device from Urahara, they already knew where Ichigo was, and so it took them only a short while before they finally spotted him. The sight of the hollow-eyed teen sitting calmly was surprising, but not as much as the location he had chosen to do so. Wait a minute. These are... Su Yifeng hissed and glanced at her companion. Negel ruins. Yoriyuki whispered, and her mind raced through myriad of thoughts before she sharply shook her head. They had no time to dwell on things not yet important. The time window before they were detected was short, so they needed to act fast. Giving the creature known as Ichigo a careful but brief look, she raised her hand and took aim. He looks so peaceful. She muttered and then took the shot. Surprisingly, the firearm barely made a sound, but it was compensated with the abundance of recoil. Yoriyuki just shook her hand and quickly put the weapon away. Then she glanced at Su Yifeng and nodded to her. Go. Like bullets, the two of them reached hollow-eyed Ichigo before he even noticed something was wrong. Two powerful kicks right to the back of his head sent him flying. Sorry, Ichigo. Kisuke said we don't have much time, so this is going to hurt. Yoriyuki said brazenly, only to feel goosebumps once she met the hollow's eyes. The creature seemed barely shaken. Furthermore, it even looked ecstatic, if the terrifying grin visible from beneath its mask was any indication. In that moment, a heavy, bestial riot suppressed on Yoriyuki's shoulder with enough power to make her eyes go wide. You lying bastard! Su Yifeng's yell shook her out of the stupor, and Yoriyuki watched as the hollow used its hands to shield itself from the petite captain's nasty kick. Giving the hollow-eyed teen one last piercing gaze, she blinked her thoughts away and joined Su Yifeng in her efforts. With a cat-like grace, she vaulted over the hollow and sent her foot forward in an attempt to kick the creature in the back of its head. To her surprise, the hollow reacted fast enough for her to miss the head and, instead, hit its shoulder. When the attack connected, Yoriyuki flinched and, placing her other foot on the creature's other shoulder, backed away. Su Yifeng landed next to her with a questioning gaze. His arrow is stronger than I anticipated. I think I felt my bones creaking. You okay? Su Yifeng didn't respond. Instead, she just clenched her jaw and charged the hollow once again. Staring after her, Yoriyuki narrowed her eyes and quickly coated most of her legs with a thick layer of spiritual energy. After Su Yifeng's kick to the hollow's collarbone made the creature stagger, she kicked the sand and mirrored the attack, though she did it from behind. Once it landed, a loud cracking noise came from the hollow's body. Grack. Whoa. In the wake of hollow's howl, Yoriyuki was forced to quickly flash away in order to evade the creature's fast-moving fist. Even then, she still received a shallow cut on the outer side of her calf. The cut stung but fortunately did not restrict her movements in any way. Putting the thought of the injury behind her, she prepared to renew her efforts when Su Yifeng flashed past her and delivered a drop kick with enough force to blast the hollow into one of the nearby ruined structures. The captain of the 2nd Division then ricocheted back and, while in midair, opened her mouth. Bakudo number 30. Shitosu Sansen. A bright yellow energy formed next to her opened palm. Using it like a brush, she drew an inverted triangle. 3 bursts of energy shot from its vertices straight at the hollow before the creature recovered from the previous kick and rammed into the hollow, pinning it into the wall behind it in a blink of an eye. A muffled growl escaped from beneath the creature's mask. As a follow-up to the binding spell, the female duo charged the hollow and, together, they smashed their elbows into the creature's abdomen. Gah! The double attack knocked the wind from the creature's lungs. For a second, its head fell low and it appeared the hollow was close to fainting. During that second, both Yoryuki and Sui Feng rubbed their elbows. Despite coating them in spiritual energy, both Yoryuki and Sui Feng felt their joints screaming in protest. But then the hollow raised its head and pierced both of them with a heated glare. Before they could react, the creature expelled a large quantity of Ryuryoka that completely demolished the wall behind it as well as the Kido that was restricting its movements. Well, I guess we finally pissed him off. The drug should start war. Yoryuki didn't even finish her sentence when a loud buzzing noise filled the area and she came face to face with the irate hollow. So fast. Barely reacting in time, she noticed a bright red energy forming around the creature's fist and immediately bent her body in order to evade the inevitable attack, but the energy quickly expanded into a wide blast that made her eyes go wide. In the last moment, Sui Feng appeared above the hollow and kicked its arm hard enough for it to miss the intended target. Despite that, the edges of the blast licked Yoryuki's side and sent her spiraling away. Yoryuki-sama. The cost of the careless shout came immediately when the hollow's other hand grabbed Sui Feng by her leg and then brutally smashed her body into the ground several times before it decided to throw it away. It was only after she crashed through several boulders and sand dunes that the captain's body came to a stop. Watching it as she slowly got up, Yoryuki gritted her teeth and tenderly placed a hand on her burned side. It was only through pure luck that her flesh and muscles survived fairly intact. The look on her face as she stared at the hollow-fied Ichigo took a rapid change and there was no longer any hint of underestimation in her eyes. "Alright Ichigo, seems like we have to take it up a notch." She pushed the pain into the back of her mind and, when the creature moved towards the place where Sui Feng landed, she acted. Vaulting over the hollow, she aimed one of her fingers at it and released a bit of her Ryuryoku. Heido number 4. Byakurai. A concentrated bolt of lightning sank into the hollow's shoulder and came out through its back, briefly halting its movement and causing it to stagger. However, once Yoryuki landed, it quickly slashed at her with one of its blades and a wave of energy flew straight at her. "Oh, I know that technique," she mentally exclaimed and, as fast as she could, she ducked. The crescent wave of Ryuryoku missed her by a hair's breadth. Once it passed her, a yell followed with a release of powerful energy came from a short distance away. Shunko. Battered and bruised, Sui Feng appeared to be levitating above the ground with a constantly spinning translucent energy surrounding her backside and her arms. With the force of a small gale, the swirling energy caused the sands of Hueco Mundo to dance in a celebration of a brooding menace. "I really didn't want to use this," she stated and slowly aimed her right fist at the creature. Yoryuki swallowed her surprise and quickly called out to the captain. "Wait. Shunko is dangerous if not mastered." Sui Feng blinked but then formed a confident smirk. "Don't worry. I need only one hit." Then she shot forward. Within a second, she crashed into the hollow and a large wave of spiritual energy burst in every direction like a tsunami, drawing an incredible amount of sand into its volume and creating a long and wide crater with the hollow in the center of it all. Forced to back away, Yoryuki shielded her eyes and tried to stay calm. She had a very bad feeling in her gut. Something about the hollow's spiritual energy was wrong. True to her thoughts, a column of dark Ryuryoku shot from where the hollow stood and blasted Sui Feng away like a pebble. Without missing a beat, Yoryuki leaped in the air and caught the captain in midair. She was alive and conscious, but covered in burns. "Damn it, B." Sui Feng formed a pained grin. "That should have done it. I don't understand." Feeling the hollow approaching, Yoryuki quickly looked up and felt her body stiffening up. The creature looked a bit different from before, though she wasn't completely sure she wasn't just imagining things. Immediately, she gently put Sui Feng down and readied herself for the continuation of the battle. However, when the hollow crossed half of the distance between them, the energy surrounding him vanished and his body came to a sudden stop. As if something sucked the life out of it, the creature toppled over and fell into the sand dune with a thud. Yuriyuki felt a relief wash over her. For some reason, she didn't want to fight Ichigo for any longer. She still didn't show all of her triumph cards, and so she was confident in her own strength. But there was a feeling in her gut, her feline sixth sense, telling her that further hollowification would turn Ichigo into something she didn't really want to deal with. This boy is way too powerful for his own good. Su Yifeng muttered as she slowly got up to her feet. It seemed that the numerous wounds covering her whole body weren't as serious as they first appeared to be. Still, the steps she took when she moved towards the unconscious hollow suggested her condition wasn't very good either. Silently, Yuriyuki only agreed with her. It had been only few months since Ichigo landed in Soul Society, yet his spiritual energy was already on a level comparable to a captain. The two of them approached the hollow carefully, but it looked like it was truly knocked out. There was no sign of Ryotsu activity and the creature's breathing was even. Crouching down, Yuriyuki grabbed the hollow by its shoulder and picked it up. They had wasted too much time and released too much Ryotsu for them to be able to relax. It was time to open the Gargantat and leave the hollow world behind them. Bankai, Suzumushi Suishiki, Inmakuragi. Before either of them could react, both Yuriyuki and Su Yifeng found themselves surrounded by darkness that immediately robbed them of all of their senses. Despite standing next to each other, neither knew where the other was. It was like standing in a void, where all you could do was breathe. Captain of the 2nd Division, Su Yifeng, and Yuriyuki Shihoin. It is a pleasure to meet you again. While she still couldn't hear even the beating of her own heart, the voice of a traitor still entered her ears and caused Yuriyuki to grimace. They had been too slow. Aizen. She growled, though she wasn't sure the man could hear her. Ah, seems like the pleasure is only on my side. Well, you can't fault me for that, Yuriyuki Shihoin, Captain Su Yifeng. It is not every day that my enemies come to my domain on their own. I was hoping to catch an infant, yet I found 2 kids along with it. Her mind racing, Yuriyuki tried to release her spiritual energy and overcome the effects of the unfamiliar ability that turned her into a vulnerable target, but quickly discovered it was for naught. Whatever the ability was, it seemed to be impervious to such simple tactics. She also had no time or means to devise any other plan. Moreover, she heard Aizen's voice, yet his spiritual footprint was out of her reach. It was almost like he only existed in form of a voice. She couldn't even feel Su Yifeng, though she was fairly sure she was somewhere next to her. With that in mind, she reached out with her hands but found nothing but more darkness. The situation turned dire fast. It is pointless to struggle. You must have known the risks of coming here. So, I'll play the good guy and tell you that you can survive and escape from this place. But only one of you. Yuriyuki clenched her jaw and tried to think of something, anything. Yet nothing came to her mind. If she let go of Ichigo, there was a chance she would lose him in the darkness. If she tried to fight, there was a chance she might accidentally hit Su Yifeng. Ah, yes, I expected you to say that, Captain Su Yifeng. Now, Yuriyuki Shihoin, what is your answer? Surprised, Yuriyuki took one last look around but realized she had been truly defeated. Even if she didn't hear Su Yifeng's answer, she knew what it was. But she couldn't agree with it. In this war, she wasn't nearly as important as Ichigo. So, she briefly closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Let Su Yifeng take Ichigo and I'll go with you. She heard a chuckle. You are in no position to bargain, Yuriyuki Shihoin, but, as a sign of goodwill, I accept. Right now, I'm more interested in you than Kurosaki Ichigo. The darkness vanished and Yuriyuki could feel her senses returning. Aizen's words startled her, but she quickly pushed the thought away. Moving her eyes, she found Su Yifeng standing in a short distance away. Aizen or the rest of his men were nowhere to be found, but now that her senses were working, she could feel several powerful signatures all around them. Yuriyuki-sama. Yuriyuki sighed and carefully put hollow-fied Ichigo down. Then she took a step away from him and gave Su Yifeng an apologetic smile. I'm sorry, my bee. The Garganta closed after her with an unpleasant sound that made her hair stand up. With the hollow hanging from her shoulder, Su Yifeng took a step towards Urahara and quickly handed him the creature. She said nothing and the scientist didn't ask. There was no need for words. The look in Su Yifeng's eyes told Urahara everything he needed to know, and the man's expression wavered. Wordlessly, he took the hollow and followed after the captain upstairs, back to his shop. Once they stood in front of the dimly lit door, Su Yifeng finally spoke. "How long till he turns back?" Instead of answering right away, Urahara opened the door and motioned her to go inside. Only once she was in the room, and after he put hollow-fied Ichigo down on a bed, Urahara turned to her with a serious gaze. "Hard to say. Depends on how far he managed to hollowify. From the looks of it, I'd say a few days at the very least." Su Yifeng nodded and prepared to leave, when her eyes, finally accustomed to the lack of light, found something that made her grimace in disgust. "Urahara, you." Urahara noticed where she was looking but turned away and started to turn on several of his machines. "Kurosaka-san is a special case, a scientific impossibility. Even I can't just produce miracles, so I did the most obvious thing I could do. To restore the balance in his soul and turn him back, there isn't a better way than to use his original human body." He explained and turned a single lamp in the room on. Its light hit the very thing that caused the disgust to appear on Su Yifeng's face. There, on the bed right next to hollow-fied Ichigo, lay another Ichigo looking just like he did before the night when he had died. It was his human body that had been supposed to be buried in a grave. Of course, after so long, his human body would have decomposed, so I had no other choice than to take his body right after his death and turn it into one of my special Jigai. Is-Hein-san doesn't know, and I would very much appreciate if you didn't tell him. It would just needlessly unsettle him." Turned away from Su Yifeng, Urahara did not notice the stare she was giving him. It was different from those full of hate she had used to give him. This one was unreadable. Full of emotions even Su Yifeng didn't know she possessed. Although, it was true that even if he did notice, he wouldn't have cared. Urahara knew his actions seemed not normal in the eyes of others. However, he did it for the sake of Soul Society. That had been and still was the mantra he repeatedly told himself whenever a situation like this occurred. Whenever he had to lie to himself in order to feel good about his actions. He plugged in the last cable and the machines started to hum with joy, the one emotion that was missing in either of them. "I feel like shit." That was the first thing Ichigo muttered after he opened his eyes and realized he was no longer caught in a nightmare. He did not remember anything from it, but the emotions of terror and anger whispered to him many things he did not want to know. His bones creaked and his muscles were sore, but it was nothing compared to the headache pulsing in his head like a timer of a bomb soon to explode. That's not surprising. Not expecting anyone commenting on his words, Ichigo twitched in surprise and moved his head to the side. There, watching him from a small distance, stood the one man he didn't want to see. Ichigo narrowed his eyes but felt no energy he could spare to get truly angry. He sighed. "I should have known I'd end up here." "Yes." Ichigo looked away from the man and looked at the ceiling of the room. "How long have I been out?" The answer came after several seconds of thick silence. "Depends on what you mean, Kurosaka-san. You turned into hollow a while ago, but it's been just a day since you ended up here." Ichigo wrinkled his eyebrows and then glanced at the man once again. "What?" Giving him a somber stare, Urahara leaned away from the room and then came inside with a teacup full of steaming tea. He offered it to the teen. "You turned during a spar with your father and then, before anyone could stop you, you escaped into Hueco Mundo." It was in that moment that Ichigo realized the gravity of the situation. His brain wasn't yet working on full capacity, but it was catching up quickly. Just hearing the name of the hollow world caused his heartbeat to increase and his mind to blanch out. Moaning from the soreness, he slowly sat and accepted the tea. "How much trouble am I in?" While the teen took a sip of the hot beverage, Urahara walked back to the door and leaned into its frame. "Godei devised a mission to bring you back from Hueco Mundo. They sent 2 people after you." The scientist continued like he didn't hear the question, making Ichigo bite the edge of the teacup. He didn't like where the man was going with it. "While they managed to extract you from Hueco Mundo, there was a price to pay. I'm sure you recall that Aizen has taken residence in the hollow world." Ichigo swallowed a small portion of the tea and placed the teacup on the nearby table. His hands shook a little, but he steeled himself for the inevitable. He looked Urahara straight in the eyes. "Tell me." There was no amusement in the man's expression. Captain Su Yifeng suffered minor injuries but she will be fine. Ichigo stayed silent. For some reason, he felt like the man enjoyed torturing him with the brief moments of silence. In exchange for Captain Su Yifeng being able to leave Hueco Mundo with your unconscious body, Yoriyuki was forced to surrender and remain there. Ichigo felt his throat getting dry and quickly grabbed the teacup to take another sip. He hit his teeth with it but ignored the pain. Instead, he focused on the taste of the tea and just how interesting the floor of the room was. He didn't care that the tea was way too hot to drink normally and gulped it down like it was cold water. Immediately, beads of sweat formed on his brow but also on his chest and his backside. His throat hurt but he refused to stop drinking. The pain felt way too nice. I'm actually surprised you are up. I expected the process of turning you back would take at least a few days but, once again, you exceed the expectations. That comment felt way too funny and Ichigo couldn't help but laugh humorlessly. After he put the teacup back on the table, he lowered his head and placed both his hands on top of it, pushing it down hard like he wanted to snap it off. Fuck you, Urahara Kisuke. Thank you, but also fuck you. From the following silence, Ichigo wasn't sure if he managed to insult the man. He could have tried again, with another insult, but that would mean talking and Ichigo didn't feel like doing that. He just further leaned forward until his elbows rested on the top of his knees and then tried to swallow the guilt that spread within him like a drug, desensitizing his emotions and numbing his senses. Once you stop feeling sorry for yourself, I'd suggest a long walk through the town. It's night so the streets should be empty. You have some time to kill before you have to return to Soul Society. Ichigo flinched but didn't respond to the man's words. What could he say? Apologize? Yell? Try to insult him? Anything he'd do wouldn't be right. He couldn't do anything. Therefore, he just stayed in his position until the sound of Urahara's footsteps lessened into pregnant silence. He rocked his body back and forth and felt sorry for himself until he couldn't take it anymore. Then he stood up and ran. Out of the shop. Away from his guilt. Nobody tried to stop him. So, he ran. He ran until his stamina started to wane and until the cold air of the night finally pierced his misery. He didn't even know what season it was, whether it was fall or winter, but the night was chilly enough for his breath to take shape in form of a steam pouring out of his mouth. Without him realizing it, he ran all the way from Urahara's shop to the house that had used to be his home. Back then when he had been alive and back then when he still had most of his family. He glanced up, where his room had used to be. Darkness. The only light shining down his path was the moonlight, mocking him with its silver lining. Breathing hard, he began walking. Minute by minute, he spent his time just walking and ignoring everything around him. The town truly was empty. There was no human, no soul and not even a hollow anywhere near him. As far as his senses reached, there was just emptiness. His steps came to a halt when he reached another place he had used to know. Houses of the friends from his past life, Oriaminu and Tatsuki Arisawa. There was no light coming from the windows. Just darkness. He felt like shit and there was nothing he could do to change that. Just like Urahara said, he felt sorry for himself and he couldn't stop doing it. It was just so easy, to pretend that he was the victim, the martyr of choices that had been done in his stead, far back in the past unknown to him. Despite not recalling eating anything in the past few days, he felt the contents of his stomach rising in his throat and he bent over. He barfed. He hoped he could barf all of the emotions. Then, like a bright light of hope, he felt a Ryotsu signature. It was foreign but also familiar. It took him several seconds to realize he had felt it once before. When I was here on mission with Rukia. He whispered and used a nearby leaf to wipe his mouth. Spitting on the ground, he looked in the direction from where the Ryotsu was coming from and clenched his fists. He had to do something, else he would go crazy. There was another person who felt the same. Standing in front of the other captains, Su Yifeng just finished her report and waited for the commander's reaction just as the others began to whisper to each other. However, one simple knock of a cane was enough to stop their voices. The loss of Yoriyuki Shihoin is most unfortunate but I'm afraid her fate is out of our reach. If Aizen Sosuke truly controls entrance to Hueco Mundo, we cannot send anyone to rescue her. Captain Kuratsuki. Yamamoto stated and turned his face away from Su Yifeng, who looked like an incredibly bitter taste spread within her mouth. She took a breath and opened her mouth, but no voice came out. For a second, she gaped like a fish on a dry land, then she lowered her head and forced the words back into her mind. Her hands, now forming fists, shook. Behind her, a captain with painted face stepped up from the row of his colleagues and aimed his bored eyes at the commander. It is possible. As of this moment, I detect several abnormalities within the layer of Garganta space surrounding Hueco Mundo, but, due to obvious reasons, I am unable to confirm or deny their purpose. However, since Aizen Sosuke most likely planned his betrayal decades in advance, it is not unthinkable that he managed to construct a device with such function and put it in effect once Captain Su Yifeng returned. Yamamoto opened his eyes a little and stared at the scientist through a tiny slit between the eyelids. Any countermeasure? Currently? None. As per your orders, after Aizen Sosuke's treachery, I began researching a method of creating a stable Garganta gate and was fairly close to establishing a prototype, but, due to these abnormalities, I am forced to start from scratch. Not looking very satisfied, Yamamoto nodded, and the captain of the 12th Division got back into line. Then the commander turned his attention back to the one captain still standing in front of him. For a moment, he said nothing. He just continued staring at her, until she finally raised her head and returned the gaze. Was there any message from Urahara Kisuke? At the mention of the man's name, Su Yifeng's face twisted into a grimace. He says Kurosaka's condition is improving slowly but steadily. I see. Yamamoto said and narrowed his squinted eyes. Then he raised an eyebrow when he noticed one of his captains trying to hint towards something. He sighed. About Kurosaki Ichigo himself. I will decide his fate once I see him. He cannot go unpunished, but, at the same time, incarcerating him would make his rescue pointless. That is all. Dismissed. Once he said the final word, most of the captain began to leave quickly. However, two of them seemed to move a lot slower than the rest. Su Yifeng was so deep in thoughts, she didn't notice there was somebody waiting for her at the large doors. Only once she came close and realized she couldn't move any further, she blinked and returned to the real world. Captain Su Yifeng, can I have a moment? Once she became aware of the person's identity, Su Yifeng clenched her jaw and stopped walking. She gave the man a hard gaze and waited. The man quickly understood and nodded to her, thankful. I know it may account to nothing, coming from me, but I want to apologize. The left corner of Su Yifeng's mouth twitched and she curled her lips. For your incompetence, or your son's stupidity, Shiba. The man, Ishine, briefly closed his eyes, accepting the insult as gracefully as he could and then nodded. Both. Su Yifeng gave him a dirty look but kept herself from sneering. Go to hell, Shiba. Just make sure your Yuaki-sama's sacrifice won't go in vain. She barked and quickly left, leaving him to stare after her with a dejected expression. When she finally reached the outside of the building, Su Yifeng took a deep breath of fresh air and placed both her hands on the railing. Bending down, she exhaled and tightened her grip until she felt the steel beneath her fingers getting soft. Damn it! She wanted to yell. She truly did. But she was a captain, the captain of the 2nd Division as well as the leader of an assassination squad. Emotions were something she wasn't supposed to show. So, she just squeezed the life out of the railing until her fingers left their marks. Then she put her forehead against the cold steel of the railing and closed her eyes. Your Yuaki-sama, did I do the right thing? Was it worth it? Can I truly believe your words? Can I believe in Kurosaki Ichigo? That he is the key to this struggle. There was a stinging sensation in her chest but she tried her best to ignore it. For the sake of Soul Society, she had to be a killing machine. A warrior. A soldier. She took another deep breath. I don't think I can forgive him for this, your Yuaki-sama. You are worth thousands of Kurosaki Ichigo. Thousands of anyone. She exhaled and the brief conversation with Ishine came to her mind. Growling quietly, she shook her head. Ostracizing and insulting Shiba Ishine was the last thing she wanted to do, but when she saw his face, all she could think of was Yuaki leaving her. Again. However, she stood by her words. There was nothing better the man and his son could do than to make sure Yuryuki's sacrifice wasn't in vain. Su Yifeng's head snapped upwards so fast, she almost hit it against the railing. There was a blank expression on her face, but her eyes told another story. Her mind was racing, thoughts forming, ideas turning into something solid. Could it work? Her eyes began to dart all over the place as she tried to picture every scenario and possible outcomes. Yuryuki-sama told me to trust in the boy. That was all she needed before she turned around and aimed her steps towards the office of the captain commander of the Godi I-13, with a plan to use Kurosaki Ichigo to the best of his capabilities. Convincing Kurosaki was the easy step, she was sure he wouldn't refuse. All she needed to do was to find unbreakable arguments that would convince the old commander as well. Somewhere in the vast sands of Hueco Mundo, within a large construct made of white concrete, Yuryuki Shihoin sat on an uncomfortable chair, tied down by chains made of Sekizeki mineral, glaring at the man that had forced her to surrender barely a day ago. The man returned her glare with a pleasant, almost sly grin that was as wide as his face, going from his left to his right ear. Now that we are both seated, we can finally discuss some important matter, Yuryuki Shihoin. With an angry grimace plastered across her face, Yuryuki reflexively jerked her arms. There is nothing to discuss, Aizen. Aizen, the man that had betrayed the Godi I-13, but also a man of principles, slightly altered his expression and turned his grin from being sly into a grin of slight disbelief. Truly? I was hoping you'd be interested in hearing why I allowed young Kurosaki to go in exchange for yours truly. Yuryuki stiffened but didn't respond, causing Aizen to further alter his expression and change it into one of clear enjoyment. Of course, you are interested. After all, why wouldn't you be? Why wouldn't you want to say out loud what you wanted to stay buried forever? This time, Yuryuki reacted, but not verbally. Instead of saying anything, she just slightly narrowed her eyes in uncertainty. Aizen chuckled. Ah, I said too much, yet also too little. Pardon me, I have a bad habit of spoiling people with knowledge they should know yet they don't. He reached behind him and picked up an elegant teacup filled with steaming liquid. Tentatively, he placed the teacup near his nose and took a deep whiff of the aroma. Camille tea. My favorite. Good against anxiety, stress, and insomnia. You should try it. He said and, careful not to burn himself, took a shallow sip. Hot. Just like I love it. Glaring daggers, Yuryuki twitched on her chair, causing Aizen to smile and slowly put the teacup of tea away. Apologies, I tend to forget the world when I smell a good tea. Now, to the matters at hand. Yuryuki Shihoin, you are most interesting for more than one reason. One of them is the fact that you possess no Zanpakuto, yet even without it your offensive power is on par with the upper echelon of the Godi I-13. As far as I was able to disclose, it has something to do with your ability to shapeshift into an ordinary, yet not natural, cat. Aizen said and watched with wide smile as Yuryuki twitched again. This time she appeared to be nervous. The second reason behind my interest in you is tied to your family name. Yuryuki immediately stopped moving around and stared at Aizen with an unreadable expression. Why, yes. I am very much aware of your status within the Shihoin clan that persisted even after your banishment. The Tenshai Hisoban, or the so-called guardian of imperial soldier garments. I am very much aware that you are the protector of certain relics of the past. Relics, which haven't been used for a very, very long time. Such as Hagu, the treasured tools, Bugu, the armaments, and the Tenshai Hiso, the imperial soldier garments. Relics, that are most interesting. Staring at Aizen in utter shock, Yuryuki felt a bead of cold sweat running down her neck that caused her to shiver. Check the description for the links to the author.